Hello, punks. Some weeks ago, I received this letter in the post. I'd like to read it to you. Dear Dr. Blaxill, BA, MA, MPhil, FRHS, as you are presently ranked within the top 24 players in the United Kingdom, you are most humbly and graciously invited to participate in the UK Masters 2026 to be held at Newcastle. The event will be 5 rounds, 2,000 points, and will be fought in a competitive environment with the aim of establishing who is the best Warhammer the Old World player in the United Kingdom. Please RSVP. We hope you will be able to attend. Well, punks. This is even better than a court summons. Even better than a super injunction. A gauntlet thrown down to me. Brave punks. I wonder if they know who they're dealing with here. I bet none of them have been involved in a coup d'etat. None of them have jacked a T-72 and broken out of a maximum security Soviet prison. None of them have swum 5 miles into international waters to seize control of a decommissioned cruiser to replenish black market supply lines. And none of them have refused to marry a tyrant's youngest daughter and then watched him bawl on the floor like a toddler. You see, punks, of course, I'm a lone wolf. I'm not in Team England, Team Britain, Team Europe, or indeed in any team at all, because when Dr. Blaxill competes, it's a team of one man. And of course, after a competitive game with my opponent, one man is all there is left standing. And I can tell you, punk, that man ain't him. So, what follows is the story, consisting of 5 brutal battle reports of how me and my Bretonnians fought tooth and nail to chase the title of the UK Master 2026. All I can say, punks, is glue your miserable asses to that seat you're sitting on. You ain't going to be going anywhere tonight. For the next 2.5 hours, you're with me. Right then, punks. It's time to discuss what's in Dr. Blaxill's army-carrying case as he wanders up to Newcastle. So the big news is that I'm playing Bretonnian Exiles rather than the Grand Army. Now before the 1.5 FAQ, there was a healthy debate amongst Bretonnian players as to which of the armies was better. Well, that is between the Exiles and the Grand Army. No one with their heads screwed on properly could seriously be considering the Errantry Crusade with impetuous tests on a flat roll. Anyway, back before the world was very ponderously and pernicately rearranged by the FAQ, I was one of those who favoured the Grand Army. Since then, however, 2 things have changed which have considerably, in my view, shifted the Bretonnian meta back towards Exiles. The first is that 1.5 has made infantry considerably stronger. They fight in 2 ranks, they've got outnumber, they've got parry, they still got their unit strength, they can capture objectives easily, and they can reliably defeat heroes because of changes to the way the challenge rule works. Because infantry are better, that means that their natural predator in the ecosystem, heavy cavalry who have received no buffs at all, have got worse. Let's put it this way, a foot knight's got a 3-up armor save and costs 11 points per model. A mounted knight, meanwhile, also has a 3-up armor save but costs 24 points per model. The reason you'd pick heavy cavalry in such an ecosystem would therefore be purely for speed and a bit of hitting power on the charge. But of course in Warhammer the Old World, speed's hardly at a premium because many of the objectives require you to stand around in the middle of the battlefield and not die. Anyway, I'll spare you an extended essay on the subject, but in my view, core infantry are in and core heavy cavalry are out. Now that rather perverse situation has us scouring the length and breadth of Bretonnia for the best infantry. These, as we shall examine in a moment, are the Yeoman Guard, which are uniquely available to Exiles. Anyway, the second reason why Exiles are better now is because of a shift to the game's meta. For various reasons, including the aforesaid stodginess of Warhammer the Old World, many competitive players are choosing to field undead. When facing vampire counts and tomb kings, there are two particular dangers. Namely, the Casket of Souls, and in particular, the Wailing Dirge. Both of these mean that Bretonnian tin men crumple as easily as a can of special brew under some drunken Geordie plus-size foot after a night on the toon. You've got to have reliable leadership if you're going to go in against these, and of course Exiles have got the Veteran special rule, which means that they re-roll all of their leadership tests apart from break tests. In an undead-focused meta, the premium on this ability couldn't be higher. Right, look, I'll quit gabbling and actually tell you what my army was. So, say good evening to the worshipful Brotherhood of Shadow and Bone. These thoroughly aristocratic, corrupt and nepotistic but highly educated individuals have been populating shadowy college committees for centuries where they've been doing funny handshakes and sealing corrupt deals. Anyway, the Lady of the Lake has long since turned her back on these exiles, and they're not getting any blessing from her. The Brotherhood's motto is simple. If Bob's your uncle, you're in. Otherwise, you're dead. So, who are they? Well, punks, why don't we let them introduce themselves? Greetings, peasant. You may address me as Viscount Bergamot Magdalene. I'm the Army General, as well as the General Secretary of the Worshipful Brotherhood. I carry, carefully selected from my collection, a lance, a shield, the Paymaster's coin, a lucky heirloom, and for some perverse reason, I've also got the virtue of heroism. I asked Dr. Blaxill ever so nicely if I could be the Army General, and with sufficient undisclosed financial lubrication, guess what? He agreed. Alright, thank you for that, Viscount. Anyway, the Viscount is actually a Baron. Essentially, this is a poor man's variation of Claude Vollier, the young Duke. For those unfamiliar with it, the virtue of heroism means that 1-6 and a failed ward save and you're dead. The very thematic Paymaster's coin enables the Viscount to reroll his hits, and the lucky heirloom also enables him to reroll one of his wounds. Assuming he's hitting on 4s, he's pretty much a 50-50 to show a heroic killing blow at the first time of asking. In some ways, he's actually more reliable at showing a 6 in one round of combat than the Duke. The downside, however, is that he goes down easy. He's only got a 3-up armor save and 4 wounds. So if he doesn't kill the dragon almost certainly will kill him. He's riding the obligatory Royal Pegasus. That is obligatory before the equine genocide that arrived with the last FAQ, which removed the Royal Pegasus's 360 arc of vision. The secondary power behind the throne is me. At my service, Baron Topley. I am the bursar of the Worshipful Brotherhood. I dole out the meagre wages to our servants, which doesn't take long, because they're not paid anything. Now, on to my equipment. I am privileged to carry the frontier axe, the gauntlet of the jewel, and I am also equipped, perhaps most uncharacteristically, for I view myself to be a most mild-mannered and impartial man, the virtue of knightly temper. Finally I have, acquired through compulsory purchase from a collection from a faraway land, Syrian's locket. Right, so that virtue of knightly temper means that this Baron gets hatred and an extra D3 attacks when he charges. This frontier axe is one of the premium magic weapons in the game. It gives you +2 strength, AP 3, and also does multiple wounds too. This virtue and this axe make for a formidable offensive combination which will have the enemies of Bretonnia running for the garderobe in terror. He can't go into dragons, but he can go into more or less everything else. To give him a bit more survivability, he's got Syrian's locket, which makes him immune to multiple wounds. I just about had space to squeeze in the gauntlet of the jewel on the Baron too. For 5 points, this is one of my favourite magic items in the game, and you'll see what mischief you can get up to with it in these reports. As for his mount, he's equipped the same way as the Viscount. While all Royal Pegasi are being repossessed by the bank, Baron Topley, like Viscount Magdalene, is giving his soon-to-be confiscated 360-degree flying horsey one last spin. Next in the pecking order is me. My name is the Green Knight. Lots of people hate me, Lots of people want to ban me. Even those people who do not hate me and do not want to ban me want to nerf me. It strikes me as something of an oversight in the Bretonnian law that the ultimate symbol of knightly chivalry and the gatekeeper to the Grail should fight for exiles' armies which are supposed to be dishonourable. Not that I am very honourable anyway, because I do not give my opponents a fair fight because I am a ghost and their weapons pass through me. Well, there's not much to say that hasn't already been said about the Green Knight. Suffice to say, I'm in agreement with majority opinion that he's absolutely broken. Where I part company with the crowd, however, is the idea that he's somehow uniquely busted and requiring his own special comp. Nowadays, it's simply a fact of Bretonnian life that most tournaments carry a Green Knight comp. The most common one is that he gives up all his points the first time he's killed, which is one that I can live with. The Masters, however, have gone a stage further. They don't have that comp in place, but they've prevented him charging the turn he appears. Now that's much more significant, and I genuinely weighed up as to whether the Green Knight was worth his points given that heavy handicap. Sizing up the meta though, I decided that it was likely that I might be facing some quite extreme lists at this Masters event. For example, an entire army of gyrocopters or a balloon-heavy CATHAY force. The Green Knight of course offers a quite particular set of tools, and I think he's actually better against more extreme armies than more conventional ones. Accordingly, I decided to leave him in, although I am a little bit concerned about the effect he's likely to have on games if he can't charge when he appears. If he doesn't come on the first turn, you're probably waiting until turn 3 before he has any effect in the game. And in very cutthroat, brutal kind of Warhammer, sometimes the game's more or less over by the 4th turn or so.
Good evening, gentlemen. My name's Miss Mascarin, and I'm the Brotherhood's magical juggler. While admission to this fraternity is only available to men, for some reason, the Shadow Brothers made an exception with me. I've got a box of splendid elemental magic tricks. For some strange reason, common to all wizards in Warhammer Fantasy, I'm liable to forget them from one battle to the next. But luckily, I've packed a lore familiar, which helps me remember exactly the one I want, when I want it.
So, a level 3 outcast wizard. In 1.0, the Exiles' lack of access to a top-level spellcaster was a hindrance. However, the changes to the modifiers for casting and dispelling have greatly increased the comparative advantage of level 1 and level 3 wizards and disadvantaged level 2 and 4. Thus, it's hardly a handicap anymore to have access to a cheap level 3 wizard who can after all pick from any of the laws of magic. While I think there's definitely something to be said for taking a dark wizard with Exiles, I've decided to opt for the more traditional elementalism. This is, I admit, largely a one-shot play to cast Earthen Ramparts continually on my Yeoman Guard unit. Because this spell is now only a 9+ to cast, Miss Mascarin's got a better than 50% chance of getting it. If she does, the Yeoman Guard unit become practically unfightable. They get a 5-up ward, and enemies in base-to-base contact with it are relegated to only 1 attack each. Sure, they can't charge with Earthen Ramparts on them, but who cares? Infantry doesn't want to charge anyway in Warhammer the Old World, because of the perverse incentive of the Press of Battle rule that means you want to be charged rather than charge yourself. Aside from the Earthen Ramparts, there are also some other excellent spells on elementalism, in particular Plague of Rust, which needs no introduction, and Windblast. The latter has only a 15-inch range, and Miss Mascarin is after all only on foot, but nonetheless I still think it's worth it. Unlike most Bretonnian players, I prefer to now run my wizard on foot rather than on a horse. The reason is simply that she can hang out with my Yeoman Guard, or occasionally with my skirmishing peasant bowmen. This enables her to hog the middle of the board and give her maximum coverage for her 24-inch dispel range. That's part of the point of wizards in Warhammer the Old World. Getting spells off and stopping them usually amount to basically a coin flip. And if you want to be in with a chance on that second part of the game, you need to have your wizard in dispel range. Right, enough witchering about characters, and let's get on to the core units. So our first choice are the Young Nautical Brothers, who are 5 mounted Knights of the Realm. a sadly rather depressing choice in modern Warhammer the Old World. Now, mounted knights for Bretonnians are pretty much redundant now in 1.5, I'm afraid, which has all become about foot and Pegasi. I've got 60 mounted knights upstairs in painstaking heraldry, but now they're so rubbish that I can't put them near a competitive Warhammer the Old World battlefield. The only reason these 5 dudes are here is because they're mandatory. Quite frankly, if I was as ruthless a gamist as I probably need to be to have a chance of winning this tournament, I'd have crowbarred them off their horses and stuck them on bases so they could be foot knights and save some points. Anyway, there's very little to say about this miserable remnant of knightly chivalry. Suffice to say, they're going to be starting games in marching column and aren't going to be doing any fighting. Perhaps a little bit of scoring objectives here and there will be their only real purpose. That and not being killed. Next we have 4 identical units of skirmishing peasant bowmen. They are the college butler and his assistants, the porters, the buttery passage polishers, and the cellarmaster's skivvies. Now, for just 200 points of core unit allowance, I'm getting 4 scoring units and 40 arrow shots. The purpose of their shooting isn't to inflict any major damage, although I do have Plague of Rust in my army, but to just ping off the old model here and there at quite extreme range to prevent enemy units scoring. They are only 10 strong themselves, of course, and so literally one shot of a water pistol will stop them scoring for me. But you see, again I differ from other Bretonnian players who prefer to run 12 or 13 of these. That's because I think if anybody makes any kind of attack on the peasant bowman, they're probably going to lose several models, so they may as well just have the minimum unit size rather than carrying any excess. Having more units also means that you have more drops, which enables you to out-deploy your opponent. Now, if I was being super tactical, I'd have selected 2 of these units in close order and 2 of them with skirmishers. The reason I like having some of them in close order is because you can deploy them in marching column. They do lose a few bow shots, but it means that you can surge forward and redirect enemies. Redirection ain't a term you hear much in Warhammer the Old World because players don't use chaff like they used to in previous editions. Now, skirmishers can of course act as chaff in their way, but enemies will continue along the same line they charged when they pursue them. If you want to make the enemy close the door in an inconvenient direction, you need a close or an open order formation. That's why I think Bretonnian players would do well to make some of their peasant bowman units close order rather than just opting for skirmishers all the time. Right, next we have the amalgamated ununionized college servants, who are 35 yeoman guard with full command, a Grail monk carrying a blessed triptych. This unit, of slightly elevated peasantry, is one of the main reasons why I'm bringing exiles to this event in the first place. The reason is just because they're great value for their points. Essentially, they're slightly upgraded men-at-arms. They cost 5 points rather than 4, but they have several key advantages. They don't have levy, so they're able to use your general's leadership. They've got a point more weapon skill. They've got veterans, so they can re-roll their leadership tests, and they can pick a modest magic banner. For just 230 points, I get an exceptionally hard-to-shift unit. If the enemy don't kill the Grail monk, they'll be stubborn in the first round of combat, which can also be commuted to give ground by dint of their shield wall. They're going to be bringing in a static combat resolution of +5. Because they're able to switch between their halberds and their hand weapons, they're also going to have a 4-up armor save in combat, combined with a respectable weapon skill of 3. With earthen ramparts on top of it, it's going to be more or less impossible for the enemy to shift this unit. Now, I could have gone to town even more and given them a magic banner. The war banner for an extra combat res is hardly ever a bad thing, and then it's very popular to have the Monster Hunter's tapestry with them, so they can't be stomped. I did seriously consider the latter, but I decided that I've got earthen ramparts there to do the same job, and I don't want to do the same thing twice. This Yeoman Guards unit's purpose is fairly predictable. It's just a stubborn meat shield to act as a bunker for Miss Mascarin, take a pounding and not die, and give my other stuff time to charge into whatever's fighting it. I've got one special unit, and this is the Keepers of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. These guardians of the real Lord and Master of the Shadow Brothers, i.e. the bottom line, are 4 Pegasus Knights with a champion and a banner. Now, some Munchkin-y list builders will no doubt be saying, well, Dr. Blaxill, why don't you have a 5th Pegasus Knight so you can get a lookout, sir, for your characters? This is the kind of question that, in my view, arises from Munchkin thinking, which is to build as strong a list as you can on paper. What Munchkin thinking misses, however, is the realities of the actual gaming table. A 5th Pegasus Knight is often largely redundant because it expands your frontage to such a degree that his attacks are wasted. More to the point, the terrain rules in Warhammer the Old World, where you can hide behind forests, hills and buildings, give your heroes ample opportunity to avoid being cannoned off. Now, this is a massive change compared to 8th edition. In that version of the rules, cannonballs weren't stopped by hills or forests, so the only things you had to reliably hide behind were buildings. Also in those days, cannons did d6 wounds. They went completely through your armour. You only got 1 ward or regen, and you had many less wounds. That's why, quite frankly, Warhammer the Old World feels like a bit of a cakewalk from the perspective of a hero when you're coming against artillery. Anyway, these Pegasus Knights are there to do a lot of my fighting. As everyone knows, they're very powerful pieces, because they've got furious charge. Now, you do have to be a little bit more conservative with Pegasus Knights in an Exiles army, because of course they don't get the blessing of the lady. They are, however, by dint of their mobility, one of those units who tends to get it back on quite a regular basis, which you do as per the Exiles rules, by running down or overrunning against a foe. And finally, for my army, we have Qui Bono and Coup d'Etat, which are 2 Border Princes bombards. Now, having just gone on a bit of a rant to tell you why I don't think cannons are all they're cracked up to be in this edition of the rules, I still think having 2 of the blighters is well worth its points. Now, I don't know what it is about me and cannons in games of Warhammer, but they never seem to hit, and they always seem to explode. I've fought 3 games so far with this Bretonnian Exiles army, and I've lost both bombards in 2 of them. I'm hoping they put in a rather more reliable performance in this event. So, that was my army. I must admit I'm not that confident. My opponents are, after all, going to be the top 24 players in the UK. Many of them, as is of course their right to, will be chasing the meta hard, and that means I think that I'm going to be facing a lot of undead and CATHAY. While I think my Exiles will do better against this opposition than the Grand Army would have done, I wouldn't exactly say I'm confident. Something else happened in the days leading up to the tournament that further reduced my chances of doing well at this event, quite literally. This took the form of a stern email from the tournament officiators. They had spotted an error on my list. On several of my knightly characters, I had neglected to specify that they had the Exiles vow. I was given the choice, or perhaps we may say a Hobson's choice, of playing without the Exiles vow because I had not specified it, or copying a 1-point tournament point penalty to change it. Of course, I argued my corner. I completely understand why tournament point penalties are necessary for illegal lists. My argument was that my mistake was typographical. It was surely a statement of the obvious, I argued, that my army of Exiles Knights had the Exiles vow. There would be no competitive advantage to you not taking it, given that it gives you stubborn and allows you to re-roll your leadership tests. In my experience, Bretonnian players who use Exiles or Crusaders don't habitually specify this on their rosters, and I found one of the other players at the Masters who was using Crusaders had also neglected to do so as well. Unfortunately, my protestations were in vain. Later I discovered that those on the UK tournament committee had apparently taken a vote on just how many tournament points they were going to deduct Dr. Blaxill for his typographical error. Apparently, I had been very leniently dealt with and only being deducted a single tournament point, for harsher penalties were considered. Well, punks, let's just say that the committee ain't going to be getting a Christmas card from me. So, it was time to pack up my army and head up to the northeast. Now, I had wanted to go to one of these events, organised by Forgotten North Gaming, for some time. It's actually held in a hotel that's inside Newcastle Airport. I've seen some pictures of it online, and it looks like an absolutely fabulous venue. The venue's location in the airport actually made me seriously consider flying there. This aviation plan, though, was rather scuppered by Storm Goretti, which had been wreaking havoc with British flights for several days prior to the event. I couldn't gamble on my flight being cancelled, so instead decided to take the train and was fortunate to get to Newcastle only slightly delayed. As I consumed my late-night dinner at a seedy fish and chip shop in the centre of town, I found the party capital of the UK to be oddly quiet given it was a Friday night. Perhaps fear of the storm had kept people indoors, or perhaps things have just changed compared to what they were like when I was last up here 10 years ago. Anyway, I then took a cab to the airport. Being as I am an idiosyncratic man, I decided not to stay at the hotel that the event was actually happening in. I'd had several rather underwhelming encounters in other Hotel Britannias elsewhere in the UK. On one occasion, I remember shivering my socks off throughout one very cold night in Nottingham because they were so stingy that they wouldn't turn the heating up. Anyway, I decided to take my chances at the rather more modern Hilton Hotel across the road. There I had the pleasant experience of finding my accommodation to be rather better than I had supposed. The room was pleasantly furnished and lit, and was equipped with a bathtub. It was also pleasantly toasty, which was just as well because there were several inches of snow outside. So after an excellent night's sleep and an agreeable breakfast, it was time to begin day one of my master's campaign. A frosty chill hit me as I exited my hotel to make my way across the large airport car park. As my feet crunched across the early morning snow en route to the Britannia, I considered my first round matchup. Now I must admit I had not exactly done my homework in advance of this event. That is to say, familiarising myself with all of my opponent's lists and conceiving of plans of how I might beat them. Even a cursory reading of my opposition, though, made it obvious that I'd been extremely fortunate with my round one matchup. Well, punks, we might as well wind our clocks right back to the LGT of 2024, because it's a double dragon chaos extravaganza. In other words, precisely the kind of army that Bretonnia excels at beating. It's commanded by Mark Muslak, who is a very skilled player who I've had the privilege of fighting once before with his vampire counts. I call it a privilege in the gentlemanly sense, but you see he had 6 screams and I spent the entire game running away. Anyway, this time the boot's on the other foot, and as I say, I think it's an extremely good matchup for me. The 2 dragons are both exalted heroes, which seems to be the fashion now for Chaos players. Both of them are the triple save loadouts, one with the Crown of Everlasting Conquest and the other with the Talisman of the Carrion Crow. Both of these, like many of the unit champions and the Chaos Knight units, have the brass collar of Khorne, giving them magic res too. Aside from those 2 dragons, which occupy exactly half the points in the army, the rest of Mark's force consists entirely of mounted warriors. The threatening part of this are 2 units of 6 Chaos Knights with the Mark of Khorne, and a unit of 7 Chaos Chosen Knights with the Mark of Khorne. He's then got 3 units of Marauder Horsemen with flails, one of which is ambushing. These are fully replete with all of the Nurgle buffs, which give them an extra toughness and the ability to pray to get toughness 5 for 1 turn only. Now, quite frankly, I could barely think of a better matchup for my Bretonnian force than this. It's not just because I've got the heroic Killing Blow Baron in my list. It's mainly because none of Mark's army is 360, and practically all of mine is. If I give him the opportunity to get any good charges off, it's almost certainly because I'm going to have failed an overrun check or have blundered catastrophically positionally. I'm very pleased to see that he's got the Mark of Khorne on all of his knight units. This of course gives them ferocious killing power due to the extra attacks they get on their frenzy. But it also means, as per the very absolutist frenzy rules in this edition of the game, that they have to charge if I give them an opportunity. To be honest with you, until somebody convinces me otherwise, I can't see any competitive use for frenzied units in high-level play. That's because against any competent opponent, you're almost certainly going to be pulled out of position. As for the Marauder Horsemen, well, they are troops that I do rate as far as scoring is concerned, but they're no good against 360-degree Pegasi or Pegasi heroes. The final problem that Mark has in this game, as if he didn't already have enough of them, is the scenario. It's domination. That means at the end of the game, if there's a table quarter that has any of your units in and the opponent doesn't, you get 200 victory points. If you've got a higher unit strength than him in a table quarter, you get 100, and if it's more than double, 150. Mark's got a very small and elite army, which isn't always easy to control because of Frenzy and the Impetuous rule on those 2 dragons. Meanwhile, I've got a much larger model count and much more manoeuvrability and flexibility. So, as you can see, this is how we deploy. You'll see that I have boldly pushed forward with both Baron Topley and Bergamot Magdalene, as well as my Pegasus Knights in the centre of the board. That's simply because Mark doesn't have any shooting, and so there's no real reason for those barons to cower. The vulnerable parts of my army are unsurprisingly my Joke Corps Knight unit, and perhaps more surprisingly my solid brick of Yeoman Guard. That's the one target that Mark's horses absolutely want to slam into with their first charge and vast number of attacks. I plan to run my Corps Knight unit up the left-hand side of the board and hopefully score the domination objective by taking the top left-hand table quarter. The Yeoman Guard, meanwhile, are mostly going to sit in my deployment zone and act as guardians for my 2 bombards. In the middle of the table, I deploy 2 of my archer units in close order and in marching column. The reason for this is to surge forward and act as redirectors for those frenzied Chaos Knights. For the sacrifice of a mere 50-point bowman unit, I ought to be able to turn those knight units round and have their flanks sticking out looking at all my Pegasi. We dice for first turn, and I win the roll-off. Unfortunately for me, the Green Knight doesn't appear at the first time of asking, which means my turn 1 is relatively quiet. Bergamot Magdalene sidles out of the forest and plonks himself in the middle of the battlefield, giving himself excellent coverage against those 2 dragons. Meanwhile, Baron Topley, there on the left in purple, scoots round to the side and plonks himself in front of one of those Chaos Knight units. Because it's got Frenzy, that regiment is going to be obliged to charge me in the next turn, but that's exactly what I want. Elsewhere, my bowman unit on the left-hand side surges forwards to cover itself behind the hill. My Knights of the Realm push forward because there's nothing on the left of the battlefield, and then we move to the shooting phase. Now I realise that many players would fire their cannons at those dragons. However, in my view, when you've got 3 different kinds of armour saves and only 2 cannons and the dragons have got 9 wounds each, there's almost no point bothering. If the dragons are going to die, it's going to be because I break them in combat or chop their head off by rolling a 6 with Monster Slayer. Therefore, the bombards elect to fire at the knights. The first pings off a rider from the unit in front of Topley, which is good news for the Baron's life insurance premium come Mark's turn 1. The second cannon, on the far left of my battle line, has a much more plumb shot and skirts a cannonball across the flank of the chosen knight unit on the right, throwing 2 of the riders from their saddles. My peasant bowmen also ensure that Mark's 3rd knight unit doesn't escape unscratched, and an arrow bursts through one of the knight's breastplates. In Mark's turn 1, the Chaos Knight unit in front of Baron Topley are compelled to charge. The Baron sees them coming and digs his stirrups into his Royal Pegasus, urging the beast forward in a counter-charge. I only roll a 1 on my distance, meaning that the Baron gets up to initiative 6 while the Chaos Knights are at 7. Because I don't want to be facing 9 strength 6 lance attacks to the face, the Baron slams down his Gauntlet of the Duel and escapes into a challenge. In it, the Baron rends apart his foe with his frontier axe and virtue of knightly temper, slicing the Chaos Champion down for 2 overkill. Because I shot one of the riders off with my cannon in the last turn, the knight unit now has less than unit strength 10 and so doesn't get its close order bonus. Quite frankly, I would have been very happy to see that knight unit stick, because I'd have been able to chop it up with the frontier axe in the next turn and the knights wouldn't have been able to lose their lances. Unfortunately, however, the knights break and burst through the dragon that's positioned itself behind them. This is rather a good piece of play from Mark. It prevents the Baron pursuing them, because of course he'd hit the dragon, and that's not a fight I want. Fortunately for me, the Baron avoids committing hairy-carry and passes his overrun test. This places me in an excellent position to flank the second knight unit in my next turn. Elsewhere, on the right-hand side of the battlefield, Mark's chosen knights use the drilled rule to reform themselves into a marching column and surge forwards into the middle of the battlefield. They're accompanied to their right by Mark's secondary exalted champion on his dragon, who seems to have no qualms about staring down Viscount Magdalene with his Monster Slayer virtue. To be honest, I think given the matchup and given the way this game has started, that's a fight that Mark wants. You see, the problem with Viscount Magdalene is that he's really a 50-50 man. If I go into that dragon, sure, I'll have about a 50% chance of heroically blowing it in a single round of combat. But if I don't, the chances are that I'll die. As far as I'm concerned, I don't think that's a risk I need to take. Bretonnian turn 2 gets off to a sumptuous start as the Green Knight bursts forth from the woodland in my deployment zone. Of course, owing to the nerf that the Masters have in place to his rules, he's not able to charge this turn given he's just appeared. However, he's got plenty of good options, and I decide to run him out in front of the chosen Knight unit, which Mark has pushed forwards. Now, troops in marching column don't normally have to declare a charge if they're frenzied, they just simply sit there. However, because Mark's got drilled on these knights, they're going to be obliged to use that, and they'll have to charge the man in green. They do have ensorcelled weapons, of course, and so are able to damage me, but I still think in the longer term that's a fight I'm going to win, especially with the Pegasus Knights coming in from the south. The main target for my offence is going to be the Chaos Knight unit in the middle of the board, and Miss Mascarin summons a Plague of Rust to drop the knight's armour. The unfortunate riders are set upon by both my barons, Topley from the side and Magdalene from the front. The knights do countercharge the latter, but with the initiative bonuses going in my favour, both barons, with the combination of the virtue of heroism and knightly temper, chop the riders to pieces. Topley, because he's already out of Mark's second dragon charge arc, decides to stay where he is. I then suffer the first piece of ill fortune of this game. Magdalene was perfectly placed to overrun into the Marauder Horseman behind the knight unit that he's just helped destroy. He needs just an 8 to get into them, but the dice come up a 4 and he stumbles forwards. The problem with this, of course, is that he's rolled so pitifully low that he's failed to get out of the arc of Mark's primary dragon. This is precisely the sort of glimmer of hope that I think Mark was waiting for. In his next turn, he's going to have a very good charge, and with it, a chance of getting back in this game. Aside from this action with the Barons and the Green Knight, the rest of my army largely stays put. The only other action is my 4 Pegasus Knights flying up the table to come to rest to the left of that lake. In the shooting phase, both my bombards and all of the available arrows are pumped into the chosen knights. Once again, 2 of them are unhorsed, leaving just 3 of the original 7 remaining. In Mark's turn 2, he makes 2 charges. The first is the trio of chosen knights who are forced to pile into the Green Knight. The second, which gives him an actual chance of getting back in this game, is his primary dragon charging the Viscount. Now, not only was I unlucky by not overrunning out of the dragon's charge arc, I've also been unfortunate with positions. If the Viscount chooses to flee from Mark's dragon, he'll simply bounce through Baron Topley. Then, without having to redirect into the Baron, Mark will simply be able to continue to complete the charge along the same line that he would do if he was going for the Viscount. He'll then hit Topley, I won't be able to countercharge and I won't be able to flee, kill him, and then overrun into the fleeing Viscount. It's a trap. If I choose to flee this charge, I'm going to lose both barons. Viscount Magdalene thus grits his teeth to take what's coming to him. That overrun last turn has earned him his blessing back, but nevertheless, this is a charge I'd rather not have to take. There's not a great deal to say about the rest of Mark's movement. He's able to rally the 4 Chaos Knights who Baron Topley broke, but apart from that, he scoots around with his 2 Marauder Horsemen, but unfortunately the 3rd unit don't show up as ambushers. The secondary dragon advances, landing to the north of that large rock formation and covering itself from one of the bombards while staring down Miss Mascarin and the Yeoman Guard. We move on to what promises to be a game-deciding combat phase. The combat between the Chosen and the Green Knight ends in a stalemate, with the man in green hacking down the unit champion and scoring 1 overkill for a drawn combat. We then come to the big combat of Army General versus Army General in true classic Hero Hammer Old World style. I must admit that while on a strictly tactical basis I didn't want this combat to occur, part of me is pleased that it's happening. In the days prior to this battle, Dr. Blaxill had been having a drink with a certain spiritual lady. She had performed an eclectic little ritual and promised me that if the Viscount did dare to face the dragon in combat, it was written in the stars that he should slay it. Right, let's see if her faith is justified. Now, of course, 2/3 of the threat from Mark's dragon is happening at Initiative Step 1 in the form of the Exalted Champion's Great Weapon attacks and the Beast's Thunderstomp. The Royal Pegasus flits this way and that to avoid the dragon's claws, and the Viscount is lucky to just drop a single wound. The Viscount reaches for his own sword, but connects with only 1 of his 4 blows. Through the corner of his visor, he sees the lustrous gleam of the Paymaster's coin. The Viscount's mind is full of pictures of rocketing stock portfolios, and somehow time dilation occurs to turn 3 of his misses into hits. The wound roll comes up, and there's that magic 6. Mark duly fails his ward save and his dragon collapses into a 500-point pile of goo. That's the prophecy fulfilled, and with it, surely the end of Mark's chances in this game. Bretonnian turn 3 emerges, and with it there's more bad news for Mark. On the north of the table, Baron Topley jumps forwards into that Chaos Knight unit for round 2 and sends them packing off the table. This in turn panics the Marauder Horse who are cowering behind them, and they fall back in good order off the board. The Green Knight, who's fighting that pair of chosen knights, who's now all that's left of Mark's heavy cavalry, are joined in the field by the 4 Pegasus Knights and the Viscount. Against this vulgar and utterly excessive display of force, the 2 remaining riders are smashed into oblivion. On the bottom of the battlefield, Miss Mascarin gets off a plague of rust on Mark's secondary dragon, and the beast screams as one of the bombard buries a cannonball in its head and it drops 3 wounds. There is really very little else to say about this game. The Pegasus Knights fly up to the northeastern table quarter and hunt down that 5-man unit of Marauder Horsemen who are cowering up there behind the hill. In Mark's turn 4, his secondary dragon charges Miss Mascarin, who elects to flee but still stays on the table. His dragon attempts to redirect but fails and surges forwards with its flank sticking out right in front of my yeoman guard. My turn 5 sees me have a quite remarkable run of bad luck, but of course it doesn't matter because the game's already over. Even though the yeoman guard need literally only a 6-inch charge to get into the side of that dragon, even with warband they fail it. Both bombards, one of them with grape shot and one of them with conventional fire, open up on the ambushing Marauder Horse unit that came on in Mark's last turn. Both of the bombards misfire and both of the bombards explode. Without these 2 self-inflicted casualties, Mark wouldn't have killed a single model from my entire army. The conclusion of this game sees some parlour games with Mark's remaining dragon who tries to hunt down Miss Mascarin. The outcast warlock had actually taken a wound earlier when one of her spells miscast. Mark, hoping that his army will kill at least 1 model from my army, places his dragon right in front of Miss Mascarin and elects to breathe fire over the illustrious warlock. He needs a 3-up to kill her, but of course goes and rolls a 1. And that is really, truly and emphatically that. The only model that remains from Mark's entire army is his secondary dragon. While this little game of chase involving Miss Mascarin was going on, the rest of my army spread itself out over the entire field, allowing me to claim 3 of the table quarters uncontested. With that, and scoring 150 for double outnumbering Mark in the remaining table quarter, I secure an extra 750 points for the domination. Even in the rather brittle ecosystem of dialed-up competitive Warhammer the Old World, you don't see too many games as one-sided as that. It's thus no surprise when we count up the victory points that it's a thumping 20-0 victory to the Bretonnians. In conclusion, I don't think there's too much to say about this game. Both Mark and I knew that this was an extremely difficult matchup for the Warriors of Chaos, and to have any chance in it, he was going to have to rely on me making a pretty bad strategic blunder with my movement, or having some other severe piece of ill fortune. As it transpired, I did have some bad luck, but none of it helped him. My cannons both blew up, but the battle was already over when they did. Meanwhile, going for gold with his general, trying to take advantage of the Viscount's flaccid overrun, only had the effect of getting his general killed. So that was the end of round 1. Having disposed of my opponent in only a little over 2 hours, I decided to return to my lodgings in the Hilton Hotel. There, while most of the other players were continuing to slug their games out, I enjoyed a nice warm bath. Naturally, I speculated on what kind of opponent I would face for my round 2. This would be a player who also would have achieved a similarly one-sided walkover in his game 1. I don't think there are too many prizes for guessing, punks, what opposition I'm going to be facing next. So, retracing my footsteps across the snow-laden car park, I head for table 1. This table is, of course, the streaming table. Being as it is the Masters, and being as this is table 1, we will have a larger, virtual audience of persons spectating upon this game. I wonder, punks, if you've worked out what this opposition is yet. So, there you are. It's King Pash and his Grand CATHAY. A combination of army and man that had been wrecking old world tournaments the length and breadth of the country. Apparently, he's not lost a game with his CATHAY yet, and I'll have no intention of making an exception for me.
I'm gonna do some spells, if that's alright.
Yes, go ahead. Ni hao, ni hao. You would have had to have been living under a stone to have not absorbed at least some of the aftershock of CATHAY Gate. This is of course the latest army for Warhammer the Old World, and the only dedicated new faction that has come with this reboot of the game. The problem, of course, is that they are absurdly overpowered. Perhaps more overpowered than any army has ever been in any edition of fantasy. The advent of having their armies smashed to pieces by CATHAY has galvanized even the most fervently anti-comp player behind doing something about them. At the time of recording, CATHAY have of course received a major nerf from our Lord and Master at Nottingham. But that's now, and this game was then. There is some comp that the Masters have put in place to try and clip the wings, or shall we say puncture the balloon, of this menace from the east. The major focus of that comp has of course been restricting the Sky Lanterns. You're only allowed 2 of them, or if you're going to use a character balloon, with 10 wounds, toughness 5 and goodness knows how many saves, you're only allowed 1. There is some other comp in here as well. For example, saying that the Ring of Jet is no longer an extremely common magic item. That means you're only going to be facing 1 of it, rather than 6 or 7. Now even with all this aggressive comp, a betting man would hardly give 9/10 of CATHAY's opponents any more than an outside chance. However, I do think that a Bretonnian Flying Circus is one of those armies that can genuinely be competitive against this foe. I say can. The Bretonnian player is going to need a lot of luck, and can't afford to make any mistakes. So, what's Pash got? To be honest, I don't think there's an enormous amount of finessing to CATHAY list building. Everyone knows what the busted stuff is, and it's really just a question of squeezing as much of it as you possibly can, given the restrictions of a comp. It really comes down to, are you going to have 3 Shigengans or 4? Are you going to have a character balloon or 2 normal balloons? Or are you going to have 2 cannons or 3? I suppose I shouldn't be too critical. When I started in Old World, it was really a question of whether I had 10 Pegasi, 11 Pegasi, or 12 Pegasi. That, unfortunately, is the rather reductionist state of competitive Old World punks. But let's not complain about that. We're here to play. So, what's Pash got? So, first we'll talk about the 3 Shigengans, or Shugs as they are colloquially known. Now, in very brief and simple terms, these pieces are fantastic at combat, fantastic at magic, and cost less than what any normal army would pay for a specialist in one or the other. One of them is, of course, the Monkey King. He carries a Strength 10, D3 Wounds, AP4 weapon that he combines with the Spectral Doppelganger spell from the Law of Illusion. If he gets that spell off, you take 2d6 hits of Strength 10, AP4, D3 Wounds, not even withstanding his normal attacks. In other words, if you go into combat with him and he gets that spell off, you're dead. As for the other Shigengans, one of them is also a Lord, who also is a level 3 wizard. The final one, the Baby Shug, the Shigengan General, has only the Hammer Hand from the Law of Battle Magic, but is also still a formidable combat force. Now, while these Shigengans are formidable individually, they of course unlock new levels of power because they go around as a tag team. Even though they're hardly built to take on infantry, when all 3 of them work together, they can grind the enemy down in no time. The Balloon, which is also the Army General, is a strategist. Now, he's called a strategist, but his main purpose is a survivalist. He's for people who want additional insurance beyond toughness 5, 7 wounds and a 4-up armor save. Now, the threat of the Balloon, which doesn't take modifiers for more or less anything, is that it dishes out an average of about 14 or 15 Strength 4 AP1 Armor Bane shots. It also can put a large Strength 5 template on your infantry units. All of this is particularly potent when it's combined with a magic item called the Alchemist's Mask, which gives you access to the Elementalist spell Plague of Rust at a higher power level than even a level 4 wizard can muster. There are then 2 Grand Cathayan cannons, which of course have the Ogre Loader upgrade, which enables them to fire twice or ignore a misfire. The core units are 1 brick of Jade Warriors and 2 blocks of Jade Lancers. They're not really there to do any actual honest fighting. Rather, they're there to carry the Ring of Jet and the No-Fly banner. Pash's army is completed by a single allied Empire captain riding a demigryph. This man, who Pash has christened Dr. Demigryph, I would be most fascinated to know the background story of. He's arrived in CATHAY mysteriously on his own, having crammed his demigryph into the 28-kilo baggage allowance of China Air. Functionally, he's there to provide some 360-degree protection to Pash's cannons, and also allow him to put a 5th character on the table. Now, CATHAY is very fast, very powerful, and has a lot of very specific little toys, like the Alchemist's Mask, the Ring of Jet, the No-Fly banner, and the Moor Shard. All this being said, punks, I do think I have a chance. Now, my army is quite brittle and so is vulnerable to this degree of shooting. However, Baron Topley does have Surian's Locket, which is going to make him immune to those multi-wound cannons, and I don't think Pash has any real answer to the Green Knight. The scenario features corner-to-corner deployment. The objectives are 2 strategic locations, which are represented on this table by these 2 grey mouse mat thingy-jiggies. If you get a scoring unit within 6 inches of one of those at the end of your turn and it's not contested, you get 30 points. Additionally, if a scoring unit gets within 6 inches of the tower in the middle of the board at the end of the game, they score 200. So here's the deployment. Now, because CATHAY is so character and war machine heavy and also has ambushers, they don't tend to have many drops. That means if there's something you want to hide from their cannons, you can just stick it down your deployment stack and you'll usually be able to put it on after you can see the locations of his war machines. Now you'll notice that Pash has deployed his war machines to one side of a forest. That's so they can benefit from hiding behind it, pivot it in the shooting phase, bringing it into the forest, and then fire. It's an old trick, of course, and I decide to return the favour by doing exactly the same thing with my own bombards. As far as my own deployment is concerned, my only real priority is to keep my characters in places where they can't be cannoned. I make an exception, however, with Baron Topley. He's on a hill, which in this version of the rules sucks cannonballs into it, and of course he's got Surian's Locket. Pash isn't going to be wanting to take a charge with any of his Shigengans or his balloon from the Baron. Accordingly, it's rather likely, I think, that he's going to push his forces south between the gaps in those 2 buildings. Now, one obvious vulnerability is of course my Yeoman Guard brick to that balloon. I don't want him getting that Strength 5 massive template weapon on the unit, because that's going to absolutely devastate it. I thus ensure the Yeoman Guard are placed sufficiently far back for Pash to be able to march the balloon up and not be within the requisite distance to use that weapon. I'm afraid I can't honestly remember what spells Pash has got, but he's got no less than about 9 of them. For me, Miss Mascarin selects Windblast, Earthen Ramparts and Plague of Rust. She's going to need to do rather well with her magic, I think, for me to have a chance in this game. So we roll up for first turn and Pash wins. He surveys the battlefield, and to my slight surprise, decides to give me the first turn. I think his reasoning is that his own cannons can't be targeted because they've not turned round yet, and he's happy to take the cannons with his Shigengan in his balloon. Anyway, my first turn gets off to a good start, and the Green Knight turns up at the first time of asking and thunders out of the woods in Pash's deployment zone. Now, while it's true that I can't give Pash anything like the headache I'd have been able to do had the Green Knight been able to charge, I'm still able to put considerable pressure on his cannons. I stick the Green Knight right on top of them, in such a way that if he kills one, he'll overrun into the second. For my movement, all of my peasant bowmen plough forwards. There's not much point actually shooting at any of Pash's monsters, because I'm not really going to do any damage. The peasant's best chance is to score and get in the way. In my deployment zone, my useless unit of Knights of the Realm turn round to look at my table edge to cover in case Pash brings on his ambushing unit of Jade Lancers to go after my cannon. The Yeoman Guard reform themselves and hang back, making sure to stay out of range of Pash's balloon bombs. My other piece of aggression is to push Baron Topley boldly forwards. I leave him in arc of one of the Shigengans, daring Pash to try a charge. The Viscount, meanwhile, being as he is a lot more vulnerable, flaps up to the south of that building to cover himself from the cannons. For their part, the Pegasus Knights fly to the north and land on the hill. Again, if Pash wants to dick about with firing his cannons at that, that's fine by me. In my shooting phase, both of my cannons rotate into the wood to begin what I hope will be a successful campaign of cannon fire against these Cathayan monsters. Unfortunately for me, though, one of the bombards misses its target, and the other bounces off the head of one of the Shigengans. Pasha's turn 1 begins, and he decides not to take the bait by charging his Shigengan into Baron Topley. Instead, he activates the icon of Heavenly Fury to prevent the Bretonnians flying in the next turn. Pasha's chief occupation, which he spends some time deliberating, is how to try and block the Green Knight from destroying his cannons. He attempts a number of hypothetical reforms with his Jade Warriors. I must admit, eyeballing it, I didn't think this was a possibility, and Pash eventually reaches the same conclusion. He's got neither the space nor the movement to be able to gum him up. He does, however, come up with an alternative, which arrives in the form of the Cathayan's favourite travelling companion, Dr. Demigriff. The Doctor, who got his PhD from the University of Blocking Studies, runs through the wood and sticks himself right in front of the Green Knight. In order to have the gas to do this, though, taking into account the difficult terrain, Pash has to move one of his cannons into the wood, therefore robbing it of the chance to fire. For his main movement, he uses his 3 Shigengans and his balloon to float forward and go into the gap between those 2 buildings. A key factor in emboldening him to do this is the successful casting of Mayor's McMirage on Bergamot Magdalene. That's going to mean that my Viscount can't charge in my next turn. Now, of course, I placed my Yeoman Guard too far back for Pash's balloon to be able to use its firebomb on them. It is, however, able to cast these deadly missiles at the peasant bowman unit hiding behind the building on the right. He scores a partial hit, and 4 of the peasants are immolated. A similar fate befalls the peasant bowman unit on the left of the tower, and 4 of their number are roasted by one of Pash's other magic missiles. Under the command of their strategist, the Sky Lantern swivels its machine guns towards the Viscount. A vast quantity of questionably unmodified hot lead is pumped into the Bretonnian army general, but I am fortunate to lose only a single wound. Pasha's 1 remaining cannon takes aim at the Bretonnian forces and promptly rolls a misfire. Fortunately, the Ogre Loader, which in Grand Cathayan armies are equipped with numerous technical qualifications equivalent to an Empire engineer, sticks his flabby mitts inside the cannon's muzzle and rejigs a bit of this and that. Suitably refurbished, the cannon manages to drop its load right on top of Baron Topley's head, but thanks to Syrin's locket, I take only a single wound. Now there's one other particular move that I neglected to mention that Pash performs in his movement phase, which certainly has me raising my eyebrow. This is to place one of his Shigengan lords right in front of my yeoman block. This is the Shigengan with the Monkey King's wisdom, but nonetheless, this seems a hubristic act even for Grand Cathay. Bretonnian turn 2 arrives, and I have some interesting possibilities. I stare hard at the arrangement of Pash's flying circus to see if there's something I've not spotted about the positioning of his Monkey King character. I must admit I can't see anything, though. The Yeoman Guard managed to roll the paltry 7 inches they require and slam into the Monkey King. I'm bringing 6 combat resolution into this fight. Surely I'm odds on to break this Shigengan Lord. I'm not going to catch him because he'll flee through his own stuff, but I'll be able to overrun into the balloon with anything more than at least a tiny roll. Elsewhere at the top of the battlefield, I slam the Green Knight into Dr. Demigriff. Unfortunately, Pash's no-fly banner has rather soured the pudding as far as Baron Topley is concerned. With his Pegasus locked to just ground movement and those cannons standing in a forest, I'm almost certainly going to stuff up my charge if I try. Therefore, I march the Baron up to the edge of the woodland, ready to let them have it in my next turn. For their part, the 4 Pegasus Knights also follow closely behind. Where I'm feeling a lot more vulnerable, however, is Bergamot Magdalene. Not only is he grounded by the no-fly banner, he's lost 3 points off his movement, can't march and can't charge. There's not really much I can do other than just sit there. Miss Mascarin, however, helps him out by summoning some earthen ramparts to give him some protection in Pash's next shooting phase. We now turn to my own shooting phase, or should I say my cannon phase, as I've rather given up with the peasant bowman, and I spy with my little eye what must be described as a golden opportunity. One of my bombards can draw a clear line of sight through both of Pash's cannons. The first of the bombard misses, but the second, and the one that matters, smashes a cannonball straight through both pieces of Cathayan artillery. The Bretonnians, and Pash, watch nervously, aware of the manifest importance of this moment. As the smoke clears, we see the hulks of both Cathayan war machines burning but not broken. With wretched ill fortune, I've left both cannons hanging on a single wound. In the combat phase, we see what our Yeoman Guard can do against the Monkey King. Now, of course, I declare a challenge. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the changes to Warhammer the Old World since the 1.5 patch, challenges are now something of a death trap to monster riding heroes. That's because if either the rider or the monster kills the champion, the other part of it doesn't get to swing after the champion's dead. In this case, Pash's Shigengan Lord has got the Monkey King's wisdom, and so he's going to be striking last. The perfect scenario for the Bretonnians would be the Great Spirit Longma pinging off the Yeoman Guard champion and depriving its rider of a chance to use his vicious mace. To try and engineer that eventuality, I elect to use my halberd rather than my hand weapon and shield. Unfortunately for me, the Longma fights infuriatingly badly and doesn't kill my unit champion. Pash then successfully casts the spectral doppelganger, and Miss Mascarin is unable to stop it. In the blink of an eye, no less than 12 versions of the Monkey King appear in a horrible spectral array before this miserable Yeoman Guard champion. The poor farmhand is blasted into subatomic dust, and Pash scores the maximum 6 overkill. With this impressive display of rolling, the Yeoman Guard win combat only by a musician. Pash passes his leadership test and gives ground, and with that, the dream of my overrun into the balloon dies a sad and squalid death. Pash's turn 2 arrives, and I have a nasty feeling that this might be painful. His first move is to charge all 3 Shigengans into the wretched Yeoman Guard. The strategist in his hot air balloon also contemplates joining the fray. Instead, though, he decides he'll go for a little float behind my lines. On the north of the table, Pash decides that this game has already reached a very red-blooded state of maturity and levels both his cannons at Baron Topley. He's not even going to bother try hiding them. They're going to go out in a blaze of glory. Both of them fire grape shot into the Baron, and I am extremely fortunate to lose just a single wound. Then we come to a unit that I have hitherto neglected to mention, which are of course the ambushing Jade Lancers. They've wandered on to the northeastern corner of the battlefield and are looking at the Green Knight. The champion evokes his Ring of Jet, which of course casts the bound spell Unquiet Spirits. This does 3d6 strength 2 hits that ignore armor. Pash rolls them up and scores an impressive 15. 4 of these wound rolls are 6s, and I make precisely 0 of my ward save. That means the Green Knight, in prime position, has been one-shotted by a 30-point magic item. I'm feeling pretty hard done by here, punks, and if you watch the Dowie After Dark report, you'll hear the Doctor wailing like a foghorn, with each roar louder than the last. Pash's shooting phase is completed by his balloon opening up. Its first act of merciless destruction is to drop its firebombs on Miss Mascarin and her skirmishing peasant bowmen. No less than 9 of the merry men are immolated by the inferno. Then we come to what Pash is really interested in, and what I'm really worried about, which is those guns being fired at the Viscount. A supersonic boom thunders through the Hotel Britannia as Pash once again hits with just about the maximum possible number he could. I'm staring down the barrel as the Viscount's armor saves fail miserably. I've taken a wound already, and the balloon has done 5 unsaved wounds. I use the lucky heirloom to re-roll one of these dice and pass it. Then I roll for the earthen ramparts, and this time it's my turn to have some outrageous luck, as all 4 of the 5-up saves are passed. The combat phase of the Shigengans versus the Yeoman Guard is an unpleasant one for the peasants. The impact hits, longmire hits, Shigengan generals, Shigengan lords, and various Monkey King maces destroy no less than 18 of the yeomen. The Grail Monk also falls in the carnage, depriving me of my blessed triptych. Fortunately though, the Yeoman Guard do the bare minimum which they needed to do, which was not break. Bretonnian turn 3 gets off to an excellent start as the Green Knight is immediately resurrected and rises back out of the lake. Baron Topley, having weathered the storm, launches himself into the first of the CATHAY cannons. Unfortunately for me, the great hulking war machine flees and bounces through its brother. Baron Topley successfully redirects, but realizes that if he attacks the other cannon, that will simply flee and bounce through the fleeing one. Dr. Demigriff, meanwhile, is a much more tempting target, because if he chooses to flee, he'll go right off the board. The Pegasus Knights are also keen for some action and smash into the Jade Warriors. My real chance of scoring big points is going to come in the south of the battlefield, however, as Bergamot Magdalene spurs his Royal Pegasus into the back of the Shigengan general. Not to be outdone, the peasant bowmen who were loitering behind the building with the red roof also charge the side of the beast. If the Viscount can show a 6 and decapitate the Shigengan general, I might have a good chance of breaking the Monkey King. There's one obvious and rather good target in the Bretonnian shooting phase, and one of the bombards lobs a cannonball into the fleeing CATHAY cannon and finally destroys it. One of Pash's Shigengan lords had disengaged from the unit with the men-at-arms, and the other bombard fires upon him and does 2 wounds. In the combat phase, the Pegasus Knights charge versus the Jade Warriors is no foregone conclusion. The Warriors of course have a 3-up save rolling 1s and plenty of fixed combat resolution. However, the Pegasus Knights roll exceedingly well and skewer 6 of the Warriors. The remainder break and run off the board. If the Pegasus Knights rolled exceedingly well though, Baron Topley rolls exceedingly badly, and even with the virtue of knightly temper and the frontier axe, the Baron more or less completely spoons his attacks and only damages Dr. Demigriff by 2 wounds. In the combat against the Shigengan and the Yeoman, the Viscount levels his lance. His first roll is rubbish, but once again his shiny friend, the Paymaster's coin, comes to his rescue. All of his attacks hit, and the Shigengan general is heroically killing blowed twice over. While the Monkey King is able to rend apart a whole bunch of men-at-arms, he still loses combat and is forced to fall back in good order. The Viscount, however, his eyes bloodshot with rage, fails his overrun test on a 9 rerollable and careers towards my table edge. Pash's turn 3 arrives, and the Monkey King, having rallied from his fallback in good order, can see the back of the Viscount. Levelling his bonking mace, the dynastic hero of 10,013 dragons spurs his mount into him. Elsewhere, the Balloon and the other Shigengan general decide to focus their fire on Miss Masculine and her peasant bowmen. In my last turn, the plucky young warlock had repositioned herself inside my other undamaged archer unit. It's no surprise when various guns, bombs, and spells later reduce Miss Masculine's latest entourage to a similar pile of corpses. In the combat phase, Dr. Demigriff finally gets his comeuppance and Baron Topley beheads him with the frontier axe. Viscount Magdalene, though, unfortunately is not so lucky. He swings into the Monkey King with his sword, but unfortunately can't repeat his previous acts of heroism and fails to show a 6. For his part, the Monkey King's auto-bonking Mace of Death crashes out a spectral doppelganger with another irresistible force. Pash rolls a mighty 10 and the Viscount's body is cleaved off his bones like a crispy duck in the Golden Lotus. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was unfortunately that. These 3 intense turns of Warhammer Fantasy had already consumed 3 hours. We had only about 12 minutes left, and there was no earthly way that both of us were going to get through our turn 4. My instinct is that I think I've edged this. Those Yeoman Guard, even though they've had 10 bells knocked out of them by the Shigengans, have still got 11 men left, and so aren't going to be giving up any points. Unfortunately though, while I'd whooped and screamed after killing that Shigengan general as though I'd just sunk a 500-point dragon, I neglected to remember how underpriced these Cathayan heroes are, and find that he was only worth a paltry 150 points. We're just about tied on the secondary objective, and when we finish our sums, I'm 170 points up. That's a 10-10 draw, a hair's breadth short of an 11-9. My instinct is that Pash probably would have had more to gain by the game going on longer than I would, but that's still speculation. I for sure would have lost the Yeoman Guard unit, but I also think I'd have been in an excellent position to destroy his remaining Grand Cannon. Still, what the game lacked in turns, it certainly didn't lack in intensity, and it's certainly one that I shall remember. Well, I suppose I came as close as any man had to putting a dent in the invincible Pache juggernaut. Close, punks, but no cigar. There was certainly no bath for me this time, and I was swiftly frog-marched on to my game 3. This was against Charlie Hanley's vampire counts. Mr. Hanley, who is of course known as the Smiling Assassin, was most friendly to Dr. Blaxill, it being the first time he had met him in the flesh. He shook me warmly by the hand, and even requested a selfie. Perhaps he's very cunning and trying to get Dr. Blaxill to let his guard down. Or perhaps he's just a nice man. Or perhaps both. So here we have Charlie's army, and of course it's vampire counts. For those of you unaware of the Warhammer the Old World meta, vampire counts, at least at the time this game was fought, are, despite being a legacy faction, arguably the most powerful army in the game behind Grand Cathay. Right, let me tell you what he's got, and then I'll tell you a bit about vampire counts, because there are some quite specific things to say about them. His general, as is quite standard for vampire counts in this game, is a level 4 necromancer on a mortis engine with the Talisman of Preservation. He's then got 2 banshees, because quite frankly, why wouldn't you? They're the best source of the screams. And then it all starts getting a little bit less conventional. He's got the customary block of Graveguard that almost every vampire count player seems to use nowadays, because they're an unbelievably strong core unit. But unlike most Vampire Counts players, he's opted to give them great weapons instead of hand weapon and shield. That massively elevates their killing power, but also makes them much more fragile. He's also gone and paid the points to put Drilled on the Graveguard too. Again, that's a departure from other VC players who prefer the implacable defense to stop enemies pushing back their unit. Now, essential to both of these unconventional choices is a level 3 Necromancer running Dark Magic. He's there principally to get Battle Lust, to turn this white unit into an absolute formidable killing machine. There's also a level 1 Necromancer running Illusion hanging around with the unit so he can get the Glittering Robe spell, and of course the White King Battle Standard Bearer with the Helm of Commandment. This is another exceptionally miserable undead magic item that simply works on a successful leadership test and adds D3 to the unit's weapon skill. If that's paired with Van Hal's Dance Macabre, it's not impossible for this white unit to start getting up to weapon skill 9. The Vampire Count's Graveguard block, where all of the models have toughness 4, 5 up regen, very often a 3 up armor save, and so many sources of resurrection that the whole unit can reliably be restored in a single command phase, has, on its own, shifted the whole meta of the game. Even notwithstanding the screams, if you want to be able to beat Vampire Counts with any reliability, you're going to have a massive sledgehammer to break through this anvil. But of course you see, punks, there I'm towing the party line. Because actually, the way that Charlie is running this unit isn't an anvil unit at all. It's actually a hammer, as I discover later. Anyway, apart from that, we've got a single unit of zombies, which is something of a departure from other Vampire Count players who usually have 2 and sometimes 3, a single unit of the ever-useful skirmishing Felbats, 1 squadron of Hex Wraiths who are excellent for moving around and generally causing all sorts of shenanigans with the Dark Wizard because they're ethereal, and perhaps most unexpectedly, there's also a unit of Vargheists. Now these, because they've got large movement, 360-degree vision and frenzy, are more or less an impossible unit to control without immense skill. I certainly wouldn't touch them with a barge pole if I was a VC player, but Charlie's obviously got something in mind. Now I was saying that VC are a very powerful army. There are 2 principal reasons for this. The first is that resurrecting models, and in the case of zombies adding to your units beyond their starting capacity, is simply something that happens with a successful leadership test rather than being a spell, as it has been in all previous editions of the game. This means that you can't stop them bringing back their models. This difficulty is perhaps epitomized, very humorously, by Charlie asking me if it's okay for additional zombies beyond the 21 in the unit to start the game on the movement tray, because everyone knows they're going to be coming. He didn't ask, although by the same logic he may as well have asked, if it's okay to not remove casualties from his units, because everyone knows they're coming back. Now, while there is something exceptionally perverse about this game's playing practice, I must admit I love it and think it's in some ways extremely thematic. Death is inevitable. You know it's coming. The second reason VC are a nightmare to face is the busted mechanic of the Wailing Dirge, or otherwise known as the Scream. Now, of course, this used to be very powerful in 8th edition, or at least it was on Terrorgeists. But now, Terrorgeists, Mortis engines, and particularly the Banshees, have all got the same rule. Essentially, you take a leadership test at a -2 penalty. Anything you fail it by, you lose wounds with no armor save and no regen permitted. Now, of course, this stacks brilliantly with the Necromancy lore. It has 2 spells, Spiritual Vortex and in particular Spirit Leech, which drop your leadership. That means that it's not unusual to be taking your Scream tests at -5. Because the Mortis engines give you a bonus to cast that most armies don't have access to, it's very difficult to stop the vampiric magic. That means if you wade into the lion's mouth, you're likely to be taking multiple tests at huge modifiers, which will more or less destroy any unit. I actually have a Vampire Counts army myself, and have played about 20 games with them in Warhammer the Old World. All I can say is that they're probably about the most miserable army to face that I've ever seen in any edition of this game. They're incredibly non-interactive, and for at least 95% of armies which haven't brought special kit to deal with them, they're more or less entirely reliant on the Vampire Count player making some kind of procedural or positional mistake. Now, because you can't rely on that in high-level play, especially when you're facing an opponent with this kind of reputation, it's probably a good idea, especially if you've got a very elite army that's vulnerable to screams, that's quite maneuverable, to just simply run the hell away. They don't usually have a lot of ranged threat, and so if you can outpace them, which is by no means easy because of the reserve move conferred by the Hellish Vigour spell, you ought to be able to engineer things so you at least get a draw out of the game. The way you can actually beat Vampire Counts is of course by destroying the army general, who's generally a necromancer on a Mortis engine. If you kill him, it's game over for the Vampire Counts pretty much. However, as I say, you're going to have to rely on your opponent making a positional mistake or failing to anticipate the way in which a combat breaks up unexpectedly, thus allowing you to pounce on his engine. And as I say, against a very good, very experienced player like Charlie, that's simply unlikely to happen. I think VC versus Bretonnians is a perfect example of where Warhammer the Old World feels incredibly rock, paper, scissors. As a Bretonnian player, why would you take the chance of dicing with very probable death for the remote possibility of being able to snatch a surprise win when you can so easily run away? Now, that's the philosophy I've adopted before when facing this army, and it's the philosophy I should have adopted this time, but several things encouraged me not to. The first is that Charlie fails to get Spirit Leech on his level 4 Necromancer. He's got 5 spells by dint of having a spell familiar, so the chances of this are only 1 in 6. This means he's going to be playing without the most potent augmentation to his screams. Given that my army's exiles and my knights can all reroll their leadership test, I think I'm actually going to be able to push forward a lot more aggressively now he doesn't have that spell. Furthermore, I'm tempted by those Vargheasts. They've got Frenzy, and so of course are going to be compelled to charge if I can engineer it appropriately. They are monstrous infantry, so I'm not going to be able to countercharge them. Nobody wants to be facing that volume of Strength 5 attacks, but they do have a vulnerability in the shape of Baron Topley. That's because I can use the Baron's Gauntlet of the Duel to escape into a challenge with the Varghul and thus deprive the remainder of the unit of their attacks. Moreover, I think that out-and-out combat units present a real challenge for a Vampire Counts player. That's because if unexpectedly one of those units fights badly in your turn, the enemy will push you back, turn round and then jump on your Mortis engine, and you could conceivably lose the game just like that. There are of course no guarantees, but I also judge that given this is the Masters, and given I've already copped a 1-point tournament point penalty, realistically I'm going to have to be winning games and by healthy margins. Anyway, this first shot here I've got is actually from Charlie's turn 1. I neglected to take a picture of the deployment. However, you don't have to see that to reach an obvious deduction. I've misdeployed. As you can see, my Yeoman Guard is stuck down there on the bottom right. Baron Topley is also too far out to the right, nowhere near his intended target of the Vargheasts. I've also dropped far too heavily on the left-hand side. There's a big rock and a hill, which is going to give Charlie plenty of space to hide his Mortis engine. I've also gone and placed plenty of obstacles between it and my 2 cannons. Now, of course, it's easy to say this from hindsight, and the board would have looked very different if I'd have won the roll-off for first turn. However, it's a cardinal sin to be out-deployed by Vampire Counts. They don't have a lot of drops, and their stuff's mostly going to have to bunch itself together. Now, misdeployment, like all mistakes, is much better if you realise it early, because then you can do something about it. However, I don't realise this until it's too late. Anyway, look, here's Charlie's turn 1. You'll note that there are 3 strategic locations on the board, represented by those 3 circular discs. Now, one of the only advantages the deployment has given me is that Charlie's more or less completely abandoned any chance of getting the strategic location on the right, and I ought to be able to just sit a unit of peasant bowmen on it and collect the points throughout the game. Anyway, there's not an enormous amount to say about Charlie's turn 1. You can see that the Mortis engine and the 2 Banshees are acting as a vanguard to the rest of his army. Of course, with that hill there and that rock there, they're going to have plenty of hiding opportunities. You can see he's being quite careful with his Vargheasts. Some of them are behind the rock, and some of them are on the right-hand side of the Graveguard. What he's doing is covering the lines of sight of his unit, because of course you're only going to be compelled to charge if the majority of the skirmishing unit can see its target. One thing that initially surprises me is he doesn't push forwards with his zombies or his hex wraiths and leaves them there with a gap, mysteriously exposing the flank of his Graveguard. Maybe it's a trap to lure me in. I suppose we'll see. One of the reasons Charlie doesn't go very far is because his Necromancer failed to get the big hellish Vigour off. If you play with Vampire Counts or against them, you'll know that that roll is the most critical one often of any given turn. If the VC player gets it, he's going to be moving twice. Charlie didn't get it this time, but he gets it in each and every remaining turn of the game. Bretonnian turn 1 begins with the disappointment of the Green Knight failing to show up. That's annoying. I really needed him to materialise out of that wood and start placing some pressure on Charlie's Mortis engine and Banshees. For some brain-dead reason, I use Miss Mascarin to cast Earthen Ramparts on my men-at-arms when they're in no threat whatsoever. I do have Travel Mystical Pathway in my arsenal, but I fail to get it. The Yeoman Guard are thus restricted to waddling forwards a mere 4 inches. On my right-hand side, the Peasant Bowmen move forwards to claim the strategic location. In the centre, my comedy-useless Knight of the Realm unit in marching column turns round so it can more effectively run away. Baron Topley, who I place too far out on the right, moves into the centre. A Bergamot Magdalene, meanwhile, mindful that he doesn't have magic attacks, scoots out to the right. Now, of course, Viscount Magdalene's a bit useless in this matchup. There are no good targets for his Monster Slayer, and he doesn't have magic attacks. Nonetheless, I don't really see what my thinking was by putting him there. My Pegasus mites, meanwhile, surge out to the left. They block the arc of sight from the mortis engine in case Charlie fancies a kamikaze charge with his army general, but they also leave it so that their own 360 arc will threaten him. Against vampire counts, it's quite frankly a waste of both players' time to bother with small arms shooting, and so my peasant bowmen don't bother firing. My cannons also contemplate not bothering unloading either, but I decide it's probably worth the risk of a misfire to just have a pop at some of the characters in his unit, and hope that he might fail a lookout, sir. Needless to say, he doesn't, and I kill a few pointless graveguard, who of course immediately come back to life. Charlie's turn 2 is also about repositioning. He pushes his Hex Wraiths forward, right in front of Baron Topley, who of course does have the magical frontier axe. However, given that Charlie's curse of years to him, and given that the Hex Wraiths have a unit champion, it's going to be pretty pointless me charging in. Now this turn is much more successful magically for the vampire counts. They get the big hellish vigor, enabling the whole army to get reserve move, they summon a spiritual vortex next to my army to drop its leadership, and they also manage to get spectral steed off on one of the banshees. Charlie's second movement phase, which of course is what you get with the reserve move spell, shows you how you can be caught with your pants down against vampire counts if you don't account for them moving twice. You can see on the left-hand flank he makes some bold, calculated aggression. The first is for the Varghese to perch on top of that hill right in front of the Pegasus Knights. Given they're elevated, these monstrous flesh-tearing demons are almost certainly going to be charging something come next turn. The mortis engine follows these depraved creatures up the hill, covering its front from a charge from the Pegasus Knights. The Hex Wraiths, who of course can move over things and do damage to them by dint of their Spectral Reaper's move, also surge forward, sitting on top of the spiritual vortex. Charlie's Graveguard, who are constantly changing formation by dint of the drilled rule, also follow up behind the undead advance. As you can see, this is extremely aggressive play, and I think it's also very good play. Charlie's turn concludes with the Scream phase. The Pegasus Knights are subjected to 3 of them, and 2 of the riders are blasted to death, with a 3rd being wounded. Now, while all this looks rather unpleasant, I still very much have the option to cut and run. My Pegasus Knights and my Knights ought to be far too fast for him to catch, even if he is able to run over 2 units of peasant bowmen and 2 bombards. Now, for some reason, I'm still feeling fairly confident when we come into my turn 2, and that's particularly because the Green Knight finally shows up. As you can see, I run him in front of the Hex Wraiths. Charlie's very welcome to that charge if he wants. It would be ghost-on-ghost combat, but I'm confident I'd have the best of it. Charlie's reserve move enabled him to cover the flank of the Hex Wraiths against Baron Topley by using that forest, and so I don't really have any good targets, so I elect to just fly the Baron out of the arc of the Graveguard unit. The rest of my army starts to close on Charlie's right-hand side. The Yeoman Guard put on a burst of speed, abetted by a travel mystical pathway. The Core Knight units also wrap round, and so do the Peasant Bowmen. They are accompanied on my aesthetic, although largely pointless right-hand side, by Bergamot Magdalene, who simply stands there flapping around, knowing that he's not really any use against most of Charlie's army. The Hex Wraith's other flank, however, does present a potential opportunity to upset the apple cart. If I charge them, my Pegasus Knights will have a flank, a banner, and the higher ground. That's going to be enough to win the combat by 3 and push the Hex Wraith through the Spiritual Vortex, which also has a chance of damaging them. Now, this is one of those charges that probably looks better than it is, but I still decide I'm going to take it. Unfortunately for me, the factor I don't account for is of course the fact that the Vampire Count's white banner causes them to crumble by d3 less. I do indeed win the combat by 3, but the Hex Wraiths get Indomitable 3, and so I only push them back. By following up though, I do at least ensure they're not going to be able to move, and so my Green Knight ought to be able to charge them next turn. In Vampire Count's turn 3, Charlie starts sweeping over my left-hand flank. The Graveguard are able to surge forward and crash into the side of my Pegasus Knights. This might rather be using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, because I think they're going to be dead anyway. The Varghests, perched on top of the hill, are able to see many targets for their feeding frenzy. They descend towards one of my very unfortunate peasant bowman units who are going to be dog-meat shortly. Charlie also decides to force a terror check on my peasant bowman on the left with one of his banshees by declaring a charge. I must admit I didn't see that coming, and the bowmen fail and run off the board. The combat phase is rather a predictable one. The Varghests slaughter all 10 of the peasant bowmen and career forwards towards the edge of the board where my 2 bombards are sitting there idly by. As to what fate befell my unfortunate Pegasus Knights, I'm afraid I don't remember. Perhaps they were screamed to death, perhaps they were chopped to death. Needless to say, they're dead. In my third turn, I'm able to do a few useful things, although not that many useful things. I do have one very good charge, however, and with it a genuine chance to get back in this game. I don't have a picture of this, but the Hexwraiths failed their restraint test when the Pegasus Knights were eliminated and moved forwards themselves in an overrun. Of course, in Warhammer the Old World, even if you kill something that's in your flank, you have to overrun straight forwards. This is an utterly moronic rule, and I don't know why there isn't clamour to change it. Anyway, suffice to say, the Hexwraiths run straight into the Green Knight. To deal with the Hexwraiths unit champion, which will challenge out a single one of my characters, Baron Topley also smashes into their back. While I'm bringing an excessive degree of force to a not particularly strong fighting unit, the pressure's really on my two characters because of that Graveguard unit standing right in front of them. They've got to one-shot these Hexwraiths, and fortunately the excessive number of attacks conferred by the virtue of Knightly Temper and the Green Knight's Dolorous Blade allow me to absolutely slaughter the unit. I now need a little bit of luck with my overruns, but unfortunately don't get it. Baron Topley easily skips over the forest, but the Green Knight, needing just a 5 on 2 dice, rolls a 4 and sticks forward, although not far enough, with his flank just offering a slither of vision to the Graveguard unit's arc. As for the rest of my movement, Bergamot Magdalene flies to the south of the forest, which is more or less exactly where Baron Topley has gone to. Those barons are in a good position now, potentially to take on that Vargeist unit. The Yeoman Guard, meanwhile, continue to surge forward towards the zombies' flank and close into the middle of the board. I'm now scoring 2 of the strategic locations and continue to do so for the rest of the game. The Knight of the Realm unit, meanwhile, reform themselves into a lance, so they might be able to help out if the men-at-arms get involved with the zombies. As for my cannons, I decide there's pretty much no point firing at the Vargeists, because the best I'm going to be able to do is kill 2 of them, which isn't going to improve the life expectancy of these war machines. The Fellbats, however, while hardly a high-value target, are much more temptingly arranged in a line, and I am highly frustrated that my cannons only managed to kill 2 of them. The peasant bowmen on my right, who are hanging out with Miss Mascarin, also open fire on the wretched creature, but unfortunately leave it alive with a single wound. This being Warhammer the Old World, and these being vampire counts, we already know perfectly well what happens if you don't eliminate a VC unit on your turn. In other words, it comes back, which is exactly what happens. In Charlie's next turn, the Bombard's goose is absolutely cooked. The Fellbats charge the first, and the Vargeist charge the second. Rather than facing almost certain death, I decide with both war machines to flee off the board, hoping to pull these undead flyers out of position. It's something of a grey area, or at least grey to someone like me who is not particularly anally retentive when it comes to a very poorly written rule set, as to whether charging units move their whole distance when charging something that flees off the board, or whether it counts as a failed charge and they just stumble forwards. I can't remember whether we got a referee's ruling here or actually consulted the rules, but suffice to say we play the former, and both of Charlie's units roll sufficiently high enough to get off the board. In the case of the Vargeist, that was by no means a foregone conclusion, which is very frustrating for me because I've got those 2 barons there who would have been ideally positioned to charge them. Now, as you had no doubt anticipated, Charlie's Graveguard aren't going to look a gift horse in the mouth and slam into the Green Knight. Now, while I had expected this, I hadn't expected something else, which is where we come to some of the perverse mechanics of the drilled rule. Now, of course, before they charged, the Graveguard decided to go wider, as they are allowed to do before making any piece of movement. The part of this that I didn't anticipate, though, is after the Green Knight is collapsed under combat resolution, which is no surprise to anybody, Charlie then gets to use drilled again before making his overrun move. This allows the Graveguard to expand to an obscene degree and actually clip Bergamot Magdalene, who was nowhere near them at the beginning of the turn. This, of course, is one of the exceptionally janky manifestations of the drilled rule, which can get even more perverse than it already is when you're using it twice in the same turn. This is how stupid these rules can be, punks. In a game where infantry can barely charge at all, we have a unit here with drilled, a heavily armoured skeleton unit, jumping through a forest with a double reform to surge forward with an agility that would make a unit of hussars look like a traction engine. I can only congratulate Charlie, though, in being alive to this possibility. It does, though, rather underscore the bad luck that I had by the Green Knight failing to get out of that charge arc. I think I can fairly effectively summarise the rest of what happens in this game. In the middle of the battlefield, the zombies turn round to face the Yeoman Guard. I attempt to charge both them and my knight unit into this wall of corpses. However, the latter stuff up an absolutely unfailable charge, and then find their entry path to the zombies blocked by the Yeoman Guard standing in front of them. The guards slug it out with the zombies for about 5 combat rounds. However, because both units, albeit in different ways, are built for survivability, nothing much happens. The zombies actually win combat a couple of times, although fortunately the yeoman guard don't break. The doughty peasants do at least ensure I continue to hold the central objective, and paired with the one that's still in my possession on the right, means I actually score some points, which is just as well, because I've hardly killed many of Charlie's models. In the combat against the ever-expanding Graveguard line, Bergamot Magdalene fights astonishingly badly. Look, he obviously isn't going to be damaging a unit like this, but he rolls rubbishly for his armor saves and only lasts a couple of combat rounds before the Graveguard drop him. Aside from that, Baron Topley, who has of course got his blessing back, tries to stand on the hill to threaten the Mortis engine and the Banshees. He is subjected to a hail of screaming and swiftly drops down to a single wound. I don't have a shot of this, but the Graveguard, once again using their drilled rule, teleport into a line over the battlefield and stand in front of Baron Topley, thus covering the engine. As Charlie quips, they said Linehammer was dead, but it's not. That then punctures the closing situation, save for the fact that the Green Knight came back to life on the other side of the board and spent the rest of the game fishing. I've lost my Pegasus Knights, Bergamot Magdalene, 2 units of bowmen and 2 bombards. All Charlie's lost, meanwhile, is a single unit of Hex Wraiths. While I've handily outscored him on the objectives, it's nowhere near enough to bring me back to parity, and when we count up the points, the Bretonnians go down to a 14-6 loss. In conclusion, I think we can say fairly definitively that I misplayed this game. I deployed badly, and allowed Charlie to use that hill to cover his engine. I also failed to exploit the weakness that I think was inherent with those Vargheists. As is often the case in games involving vampire counts, I don't actually think the dice mattered that much. The one piece of bad luck I definitely did have, though, was the Green Knight failing to get out of the arc of those Graveguard when he overran against the Hex Wraiths. While he did come back later in the game and so didn't give up his points, he was in an excellent position to exert pressure, and of course him being charged off indirectly led to the death of Bergamot Magdalene due to that line-hammered drilled gambit. The other way I could have played this game, which would have made it completely different and considerably more boring, is of course to have run my whole army away from the beginning. I must say I do think Charlie played very well though. He didn't attempt to try and trounce me because he knew that he couldn't, because I always had the speed to get away. He thus looked at the terrain, conceived of a plan, stuck to it, and happened to get a few more bonuses along the way than perhaps he was expecting. Anyway, credit when credit's due. Using that Graveguard in such an offensive manner will, I think, enable a Vampire Counts player to win games against opponents who are playing evasively in ways that a more turgid sit-back-and-scream list probably wouldn't. So then, that was the end of my day 1. A thumping win, a draw, and a large-ish defeat for 36 points out of a possible 60. Not bad, but I doubt I'm going to be anywhere near the podium with that, unless I get an absolutely thumping win in my game 1 tomorrow morning. Having said that, looking at the tab, when ensconced back in my warm Hilton hotel in the evening, revealed to me that relatively few of the games had ended in big wins. Only Pash, with his Grand CATHAY, had scored 2 absolute trouncings against the other 2 players that he faced. Therefore the podium, or at least most of the podium, ought to be fairly competitive come tomorrow. In the evening, I spent a most enjoyable couple of hours chewing the cud with a couple of other players, including Charlie, who was good enough to buy me a beer. It got to about 9:30, and I realised that I hadn't eaten anything all day, apart from, curiously, a Kit Kat that Pash had given me as a present. Warhammer seems to make some players ravenous, and they look for food wherever they can find it. I'm not like that at all, and tend to forget about it. However, now the games were over, I found my stomach beginning to rumble. Earlier in the day, I had overheard some players singing the praises of an Italian restaurant which was in the lobby of the Hilton Hotel. It was thus too good an opportunity to miss, and so I returned there and tucked into a meaty pizza. I must admit the gastronomic snob in me somewhat doubted the ability of an airport hotel in Newcastle to make particularly good pizza, but it was at least edible. A very good morning, and we move on to day 2 of my Masters campaign and my 4th game. Here I'm facing what is a quite common experience in competitive Warhammer the Old World, namely a Bretonnian mirror match, and a Bretonnian Exiles mirror match at that. My opponent here is young Jack Toll, who dedicated viewers of my channel will remember as my final round opponent in the Triple Crown Grand Tournament in Southend a couple of years ago, early in the inception of Warhammer the Old World. In that event, he held me to a hard-fought draw and secured the title. Now, in my estimation, and I say this as a long-in-the-tooth Warhammer Fantasy player who has played many editions, young Mr. Toll, despite being only 16 years of age, is the best Warhammer the Old World player currently on the circuit. I mean that as a compliment about his ability to actually play the game and move the models around the table. That's a skill I respect rather more than merely being able to create invincible army lists. Now, despite us playing the same faction, and the same sub-faction, there are some differences between our two Bretonnian Exiles lists. That's something good to see, and indeed something I wish I saw more of on high competitive tables in this game. Now, as you can see, while my army is pretty peasant-heavy, Jack's is still more so, and quite frankly, any players passing our table is going to get a distinct whiff of dung and farmer's muck. So let's start with his characters. First of all, he's got the Baron with the frontier axe and all the stuff. Hardly a surprise to see in any competitive Exiles list. However, Jack's Baron doesn't have Surian's Locket, and instead has the Grommel Greathelm. In hero wingwang terms, I think that Baron Topley, with the locket but without the helm, probably will be able to take Jack's General if push comes to shove. Next, he's got a Paladin BSB, who is there in that peg star on the right-hand side of the board. This Paladin has got the Banner of the Lady's Grace and 2 obsidian lodestones. This is a very techie kind of loadout. It's designed to protect the peg star from vile tides and also against screams, because that Banner of the Lady's Grace means it can't suffer leadership modifier penalties. Unfortunately for Jack, this is a little bit like bringing a force field to a sword fight, and I don't think this Paladin's going to be much use against me. Next, he's got an Outcast Wizard on a horse who's with those mounted yeomen. This Outcast Wizard is rocking Dark Magic, which is really a bit of a meta pick, I think, for Exiles, to try and get the Battle Lust spell. This I do think is advantageous for Jack. If he can get Battle Lust on that peg star, there's pretty much nothing in my army that he shouldn't be able to charge off. The final inclusion in Jack's character slot is of course the Green Knight, because even with the Master's nerf, why wouldn't you? Of course, in games with limited natural terrain, and skirmishing units around to block pieces of natural terrain, it's likely that 2 Green Knights are going to be rather more than ships passing in the night, given that they're going to be coming out of the same place. Therefore, I think it's more than likely that we're going to see a mirror match at some point in this game. In the centre of the field, you can see Jack's Corps, which consists of precisely 0 mounted knights of any kind. Well done, Old World rules designers, the next drink's on you. The miserable remnant of Bretonnian chivalry consists of 5 Knights of the Realm on foot, who are arranged in a marching column whose job is to get in the way and not die. We then have no less than 3 units of mounted yeomen, 2 of 6 and 1 of 7, and 3 units of 12 peasant bowmen. Unlike my units of core peasantry, Jacks can actually take a couple of squirts of a water pistol before they go down below minimum scoring. That being said, with around 40 bows on Jack's side and 30 on mine, I don't think any of the peasantry is going to be holding its unit size above 10 for much of this game. Finally, Jack's army more or less matches my own, with a unit of 5 Pegasus Knights and 2 Bombards. With the nominal exception of that Foot Knight dart, Jack's entire army is 360, and so he might as well be playing 40k. Now, I think that this kind of force is probably better adapted to the slings and arrows of post-modern Warhammer the Old World in 2026. That being said, though, I think that the loadouts on those 2 characters at the top of his army list places him at a disadvantage against me. In particular, I think that there's good potential here for me to use my 2 Barons to really boss him around. Objective-wise, we're playing baggage trains and 2 strategic locations. I must admit I think the missions also place me at a small advantage. I've got my Yeoman Guard Brick, which is going to be able to hold my own strategic objective all day long, whereas Jack's going to have to rely on these small units of peasant bowmen, which I'm pretty confident I can drop below unit strength 10 sharpish. Much, of course, in a game like this is going to come down to who gets the first turn, and I'm fortunate that it's me that wins this roll-off. As you can see, both of us have deployed quite carefully. We've done exactly the same thing by packing the woods in both our deployment zones with exactly the same unit, to protect against the Green Knight, also exactly the same unit. Both of us have also hidden our barons from the other's cannon. I've done it the old-fashioned way, by placing them behind impassable terrain and forests. Jack, meanwhile, has been postmodern and funky and has placed his baron, which at the time of recording counts as a cavalry model, next to one of those mounted yeoman units, which means it can't be targeted. I was, I must admit, initially surprised to see Jack place his baron all the way out on the left-hand side of the board, and so I think I'm going to be spared him for at least one turn. Because of this, I advance boldly forward with my own Pegasus Knight unit and get Bergamot Magdalene to join them. I arrange them in such a way that Jack's own Peg Star can't see me with more than 50% of his models, so I'm not going to get charged by them. I also use that large rock on the right-hand side to give Baron Topley cover and advance boldly towards Jack's peasants. To my mind, the centre of Jack's battle line looks a lot more flimsy than mine does, because he's not got that brick of yeoman guard, and I've also got more charge threats than he has. Therefore, I think piling up the pressure is the right philosophy. In the shooting phase, my combined peasant bowmen all fire at one of the mounted yeoman units. My peasants have obviously had their eyes tested recently, because they managed to unhorse 4 of Jack's riders, leaving just a sole survivor who passes his panic test. The real potential money shots, though, come in the shooting phase, because both of my bombards can see Jack's bombards. It has been written into Warhammer lore since the dawn of time that the number one target for your artillery should be enemy artillery, and so with that in mind, both of my cannons open up on Jack's. My bombard on the left-hand side of the board manages to smash a cannonball into Jack's. Or does it? You see, obviously I targeted 10 from the back, and I rolled a 6 on my first dice and then a 2 on the second. Given the bombard's on a 50 by 50mm base, does that mean I hit it or not? Mathematically, assuming both models were flush to flush, I think the answer to that is no, because 2 inches is more than 500mm. However, there is at least a slight angle involved, which I think changes this equation. Anyway, rather than getting into the mathematics of this, we just decide to 4-up it in good old beer and pretzel style. I win the roll-off, and Jack's bombard is blown to bits. My second cannon accomplishes nothing of note, but nonetheless I think I'm in a strong state as we go into Jack's turn 1. Now, Jack doesn't have any charges, but he does have some funky movement. You can witness here the complete nonsense that goes on Jack's left-hand flank. The Baron goes forward, surrounded by mounted yeomen, the Foot Knight Dart proceeds in marching column, and then some other mounted yeomen go around here and there. While I think that this is tactically rather good, because it gives Jack all sorts of options, including blocking his Baron from my charges with that Foot Knight Dart and shielding him from artillery fire, it looks like someone is just taking their models out of a carrying case to rank them up for a proper game of Warhammer. Only, this actually is Warhammer. The middle of Jack's battle line, which as I said looks rather squishy, decides to fall back and simply loiters on the edge of the board. Jack's own Peg Star is in rather a compromised position, because it's having to deal with Baron Topley, who's waiting on the other side of that rock. Once again, it's that implied threat from the Baron's Gauntlet of the Jewel that's really worrying Jack. If they both charge each other, I'll simply be able to escape into a challenge against either the unit champion or the paladin, where I'm going to chop him to pieces and win combat. The Baron here is making a unit worth more than double his points cower in the corner. Unfortunately for Jack, his own Green Knight fails to appear, and so he's really struggling to exert much threat outside of his own Baron. His woes are compounded by a suboptimal shooting phase. While he does manage to drop a couple of my peasant units below their starting strength, his own cannon misfires and so isn't able to repeat what mine did to his. By retreating to the edge of the battlefield, Jack's made it more or less an impossible charge for my own Pegasus Knights and Bergamot Magdalene, and so I decide to reposition both of these flying units. My own Green Knight shows up and bursts out of the waters of the lake. He takes advantage of the strange physics of Warhammer the Old World to hide behind Jack's mounted yeoman, thus meaning the Baron can't see him and therefore can't charge him. These bizarre optics of the universe are on display once again as my Pegasus Knights advance in a deliberately slim line, covering themselves behind Jack's Foot Knight Dart from his Baron. Yes, punks, strange though it may seem, a man on a Pegasus can't, in Warhammer the Old World, see over a man on foot. I must admit I was rather pleased with this piece of positioning. It's always satisfying when you're able to use an enemy's chaff against him. My cannons miss in the shooting phase, but my peasant bowmen managed to drop the remaining mounted yeomen from the unit I'd damaged last turn and drop another of Jack's units down to just 2 horses. Jack's turn 2 ain't really anything to write home about. His Baron can see neither my Green Knight nor my Pegasus Knight, so decides only to reposition himself. Jack's Green Knight does appear and heads south of the lake, while my own Green Knight headed north. You can see that he positions himself here in front of one of my bombards and also my Knight of the Realm unit. The remaining pair from the damaged Mountain Yeoman unit decide to stick themselves in front of my Knights of the Realm. They're doing this so that if the Knights of the Realm charge them, they'll have to go towards the closest model and so won't be able to overrun into the Green Knight. Once again, the Peg Star is effectively locked by my own Pegasi on both sides of the rock. Jack's shooting phase is a little better, with some of his small arms fire chipping away at me. His bombard also manages to thread a cannonball through my own war machine on the right-hand side of the board, destroying it also. All this being said, as we move into turn 3, I think I'm in a very strong position in this game. As was seemingly inevitable, I absolutely gut Jack's peasantry in the centre, destroying both bowman units, his mounted yeoman unit, and his bombard, who flee off the board from my Pegasus Knights and Bergamot Magdalene. For his part, my own Green Knight terror bombs Jack's bowmen, who are hiding in the wood off the board. I consider redirecting into the Baron, but the man in green fails his overrun chest and stumbles into the forest. Of course, the Baron is highly likely to eliminate me next turn, but of course, when you come back to life, ultimately you're expendable. On the south of the battlefield, my Knights of the Realm complete a rare charge into those mounted yeomen and skewer them. Because they can't overrun into Jack's Green Knight, they decide to restrain and reform into a marching column. Jack's own Green Knight's going to have a free swing come his next turn. He'll either go for the Knights or the bombard. Quite frankly though, while this isn't exactly rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, I think this battle will already be won elsewhere by then. My mounted yeoman unit are continuing to advance into the centre, leaving my archers to hold the objective in my deployment zone. My shooting phase sees a continuation of this unexpected accuracy by my peasant bowman, and Jack's final mounted yeoman unit is dropped to just a single model, who is then finished off in my next turn. My Pegasus Knights decide to go for a risky charge against Jack's Peg Star. It's risky because of course Jack's got countercharge. He's also got an advantage of a single Pegasus Knight and his BSB as well. That being said, I am of course stubborn by dint of being exiles, and I don't expect to lose combat that badly. I've also got plenty of stuff in the shape of my 2 barons, which I think I'll be able to ram into the remnants of Jack's unit, even if it is victorious. As it transpires, this combat doesn't really go the way I was expecting. The dice come up badly. My own Pegasus Knights do almost no damage to Jack's, whereas he smashes my unit down to just a single model. My one remaining rider uses his stubborn to fall back in good order. Rather than going after him, Jack decides to restrain and reform because of course it's his turn next. From where he finds himself, there aren't really any attractive targets. If he goes for my one remaining single Pegasus Knight, I can flee. The Yeoman Guard, especially because Jack's Pegasi have blown their first charge, are hardly an attractive target either. Neither is Baron Topley because of his aforesaid gauntlet of the duel. They also can't see Bergamot Magdalene from where they are. Given the lack of promising targets, which is abetted by the fact that Miss Mascarin is able to dispel the battle lust that Jack's Dark Wizard casts on them, Jack decides to pull the main Peg Star back to reunite with his own Baron, who is currently making short work of my Green Knight. Jack's own man in green, meanwhile, chops up my bombard on the southern table edge. Despite the fact that it feels as though I've cleared off a lot of Jack's models, my own lead is actually not very large because most of what I've destroyed is low-value peasantry. Unluckily for Jack though, his one real chance of scoring some big points, in the shape of destroying my one last Pegasus Knight from the unit he'd previously damaged, goes awry. He successfully casts Word of Pain on the one remaining rider. However, his own depleted archery resources in the shape of the mounted yeoman and a scattering of peasants aren't able to destroy him. In classic old world evasive Bretonnian style, I pull this rider back in the remainder of the game, thus ensuring Jack scores 0 points for a unit he expended considerable resources into destroying. My bossing of this game so far has given me considerable table control, and the mounted yeomen in the centre of the board continue to advance into Jack's deployment zone and begin to score off his own objective. My own Knights of the Realm, who reformed into the marching column, surge up the battlefield, and in the remainder of the game pounce on Jack's baggage train. The centre of the board sees something of a Mexican standoff. Jack's Pegasus Knights don't want to fight my mounted yeomen, who are having earthen ramparts continually cast on them by Miss Mascarin. However, his own outcast wizard gets into trouble against my two barons, who are flapping on either side of the rock, giving her nowhere to hide. Unluckily, the wizard miscasts and gets a dimensional cascade and destroys all of the mounted yeomen who are riding with her, as well as wounding herself. Featuring certain death, either from one of my barons from the north or archery from the south, Jack's outcast wizard decides to stay put and simply is destroyed by Baron Topley. The closing of this game sees various charges by Jack's own Pegasus Knights against my own archers, who mostly decide to flee. All this wing flapping, though, is rather too little too late, and Jack's not being able to recover any serious points. In a bid to do so, and because he knows he's already going down to a heavy defeat, Jack decides to charge his own Baron into Topley. It's virtually a mirror match, of course. Both Barons have recovered their blessing for their exploits so far in the game, but I've got Syrian's Locket and Jack's got the Grommel Great Helm. Things look initially promising for Jack, as Topley's countercharge comes up a 1, thus allowing his opponent to strike first. Onlookers gather to witness this classic Warhammer the Old World hero versus hero combat, and things get off to an excellent start for Jack as his Baron inflicts 2 wounds on Topley. Still more surprisingly, his Royal Pegasus also does 2 wounds. It comes down to my blessing, and fortunately I'm able to pass a single one of them, thus allowing Topley to survive on a single wound. For his part, Topley rolls through the roof and carves through Jack's Baron in an echelon of red gore. With that impressive finale, the battle drew to a close. Jack's lost his entire army, minus the Pegstar, the BSB and the Green Knight. On my side, I've lost almost nothing, just both my bombards. I've also heavily outscored Jack on the objectives, destroyed his baggage, and also claimed my own baggage train, because the peasant bowmen in that wood haven't been touched. When we count up the points, we find it's a thumping 17-3 victory to me. On hindsight, I think this demonstrates the power of board control. The fact that I had more of it than Jack, got the first turn, and perhaps because he deployed a little too defensively with his Baron and his Pegstar, meant there wasn't very much he could do to hold on to his own peasantry in the centre. As I have said before, this is the inherent gameplay limitation with 360-degree arcs of vision. Because it's extremely difficult to avoid each other, games will often come down to who has the better wing-wang, who rolls the better dice, or who makes a very minor deployment error. None of those things, in my view, should really be what decides games of Warhammer Fantasy, but very often in Warhammer the Old World they can be. Right, moving on to my Game 5, this places me quite high up the top of the tab. This is especially the case because relatively few of the games have resulted in big wins in this tournament. Looking at the leaderboard, I don't think I'm likely in contention for champion because I think Pash has already got a very large lead. But if I win my next game handily, I might well come second. While a silver medal is hardly what I strive for, it's nonetheless an accolade very much worth having, and so I go into my final game optimistic. That optimism, alas, doesn't last long, as I see what lays in wait for me on table 2. First of all, the good news. My opponent is Scott Reed, the Giant of the North and Man of the Toon. I've played Scott many a time in 8th edition, but never in Old World, and he's just about the most fun opponent that one could ever wish to face. Now, normally when we say fun opponents and give players our votes for best sportsman, it's usually combined with something else, which is to say, a player who doesn't take things too seriously and usually loses more games than he wins. Scott, though, has mastered a seemingly impossible balancing act, namely being simultaneously an extremely good player who wins tournaments and getting his opponents to vote for him for best sport. While he is a superb sportsman, the way he does this, I think, is by embodying what is going on the battlefield. By this I mean, he doesn't just talk about Warhammer as though it's a game of dice model soldiers and measuring sticks. For him, the battle is a story, and not just one of two armies clashing in the Warhammer world, but also a duel between two men, with banter, nonsense, and camaraderie that you can't help yourself joining in with. I'm sure he will not mind me saying that he corresponds very closely to a character in a southerner's ideal romanticized visit to a village in the north of England. I would walk into the Miner's Arms amidst picturesque scenery. There would be a burning log fire and an array of beautiful local craft beers based upon working-class authentic experiences. We would converse, but swiftly realize that our experience of drinking in the pub, much like our experience of playing Warhammer, was at its base element a story about man. Anyway, punks, that was the good news. Now here's the bad. That's that his army is absolutely filthy and just about impossible for my Bretonnians to beat. It is as miserable as its commander is joyous. It consists almost entirely of 2 skeleton Death Stars, one of 69 and one of 72, and numerous resurrections. There are no less than 8 characters in this list who all hide in these units, bringing to the party various magic items that contribute to making them more or less unfightable. Perhaps the most egregious of these is a magic weapon called the Destroyer of Eternities. This does d6 automatic hits with Strength 6 and Killing Blow. Not so bad in itself, but of course it's on a character who gets to stand in the second rank of the unit, and so simply gets to do that automatically to anything that's fighting it, without any chance of being hit in return. It's going to take an absolute truckload of grinding to get through either of those skeleton units, which can of course also mutually reinforce each other. Both of them shoot a vast number of bow shots, one of them with the Amulet of the Serpent, which of course gives the shots poison. One of the characters has the Banner of the Desert Wind, which gives its unit both Vanguard and Reserve move. When you consider that the Tomb King can do My Will Be Done, or indeed the Tomb Princess can do it, the unit very easily could be Movement 7 with a Reserve move, meaning that a huge block of skeletons is going to be moving 14 inches across the table. There are also 3 Mortuary Priests, whose job isn't just to resurrect models, but all of them are level 1 Wizards on Illusion, casting Glittering Robe. There are also characters in here, such as the Tomb King with Bedazzling Helm and the Charmed Shield, that are there to lock characters in combat and not die. There are only 141 points in this army that aren't in either of these 2 Death Stars, that consisting of 2 units of 10 skeleton skirmishing bowmen and a single charioteer called Dave. If you're going to take down either of these 2 Death Stars, you're going to have to be able to grind. The instrument for accomplishing that, and the weakness of this list, would be double or ideally triple dragon. My army, of course, is all about maneuverability and being able to boss my opponents with 360 and taking off high-value targets. But this army, of course, is impossible to outmaneuver because it doesn't care what flank you get it in. It simply comes down to a raw numbers game. Can you survive longer than he can? And in my case, the answer to that is an absolutely resounding no, with my army of flimsy Pegasi. In a hypothetical scenario, I could get my Yeoman Guard brick into one of these regiments, and then all my Pegasi in the flank and the rear, and would probably be able to defeat it. This would be a definite possibility if Scott's army consisted only of 1 universe-sized wingwang rather than 2 galaxy-sized ones. The other thing that really doesn't help me in this scenario is the mission. If we were playing baggage trains, or possibly domination, I might have a sporting chance of being able to outscore him. Unfortunately, the missions in this game consist entirely of the ones that undead excel at, namely 4 strategic locations in the middle of the battlefield, where his 2 skeleton Death Stars are going to be camping. Because he's got all this shooting, none of my flimsy scoring units are going to have any survivability whatsoever, so I'm almost certainly going to be conceding a vast number of points on these objectives. He can only hold 2 of them at once, because he has only 2 banners, but nonetheless he's going to be raking in 60 points per player turn, for a grand total of 720 by the end of the game. I'm probably only going to be scoring a few here and there, at best. That's starting from a very long way behind when you consider how little of this army I'm realistically going to be able to kill. I must admit I don't really have any great plan. Sure, I'll be able to evade his 2 skeleton blocks simply by running away on both flanks. My army is incredibly fast, and so there's not really any possibility he's going to hurt me if I don't want him to. It's one of those extreme rock-paper-scissors encounters, I'm afraid, that are all too common in Warhammer the Old World. There's no way I can kill him, and there's also no way he can catch me. To be honest, my best chance of scoring any points, beyond those things that are outside of his do-death stars, are probably sniping off one of his characters with one of my bombards, hoping he fails a lookout, sir. The other thing that does give me a little bit of a chance of scoring some points is that when Scott wins the roll-off, he elects to take the first turn. There are good strategic reasons for him to do this, of course, but it does mean that I am going to get the final turn of the game myself. That means I'll be able to inflict one hopefully devastating charge on him that he won't be able to reply to. Of course, there's no way I'm going to be shifting one of those skeleton units in one turn, even taking into account the crumbles, but I might assassinate some of the characters. Realistically though, punks, this is hardly a great plan, and I'm probably going to just be minimising my margins of loss if it does come off. I suppose, punks, it's just as well I'm playing someone like Scott, who could breathe life into even the most funeralaic game of Warhammer. I'm not a natural banterer if I'm playing competitively, but nonetheless I find myself indulging in plenty of it throughout this game. Much of this centres on the single chariot, whose name is Dave. I begin by asking Scott whether it is the skeleton charioteers, the horses, or merely the chariot collectively who bear this name. He responds by saying that as far as he's concerned, all skeleton warriors recall so little of their past lives that they all might as well be called Dave. Thus, all the models that I kill in this game, which isn't many, are all called Dave. Oh no, Dave's dead. 4 Daves have gone down. Oh, Dave's come back to life. Thank you for bringing me back, Dave. Oh, you're welcome, Dave. All Tomb King armies are of course high on administration because of the number of abilities they have at the start of turn, what with resurrections and My Will Be Done and Glittering Robe and all of the other various shenanigans. I ask Scott if it's problematic that all his skeletons are called Dave when there's so much administration involved. How can it be clear, for example, when Dave the tax inspector sends a tax bill to Dave the taxpayer? What if they get it wrong, and one Dave makes a payment that credits the account of another Dave? Perhaps, though, the Tomb King's language, at least in this universe, has also been replaced with just a single word. Dave, that can be repeated in varying intonations and various ferocity, much like Pokemon. We have conversations like this, punks, because this game is so boring that nothing really actually happens in it. In any case, I shall still walk you through it, because it does at least look beautiful. You will see from many of the shots that precious few dice litter the table. That's because we don't really roll them. Anyway, punks, here you will see my miserable deployment. Of course, because he has so few drops and everyone knows he's going to simply stand in the middle of the table, I have the complete benefit of knowing exactly where my Bretonnians are going to go, or at least where they're going to run. You will see here my right flank, which consists of my entire army, minus 1 unit of bowmen and 1 bombard. The knights are deployed in marching column facing to the left, so are the yeoman guard. The plan is for my whole army to go for a walk, covered by this sumptuous piece of woodland and that rock on the left. Meanwhile, the cannons will shoot him, the Green Knight will try and kill what little number of points I can extract from him, and I'll try and have a go for a heroic charge in turn 6. So here's Scott's turn 1, and really there's not much to say. Of course, I placed almost my entire army far out of range of any of his bow fire, ready to run to the side of the board, so there's not any shooting he can do. The only point of note is that for some inexplicable reason he keeps one of his mortuary priests back behind one of the units. In my turn 1, the Green Knight appears and bursts out of the lake in the middle of the board. Passing my march test, I run the man in green right in front of the mortuary priest, giving him nowhere to hide. Not sure what that was about, but Scott's obviously made a mistake, albeit one that's only going to cost him 55 points. Still, that's 55 points more than I thought I was going to get. So here's my turn 1. As you can see, I reposition the Green Knight in front of the mortuary priest, and my Pegasus Knights all fly to the side of the board behind that rock. I don't feel a particular need to move my yeoman guard because they are at least scoring me one of the objectives and can afford to loiter there for a while longer. The only point of interest comes in the shooting phase and my 2 bombards. The one on the right, that's just out of shot on my right-hand table corner, smashes a cannonball across the front rank of one of the skeleton archer blocks, rolling a mighty 10 on the bounce. 3 of Scott's characters are hit, but unfortunately they all pass their lookout sirs. A few skeletons, or rather Daves, do die from the cannonball, but I don't think we bother removing them because we know they're coming back. The bombard on the left-hand side misfires and blows itself up. I don't know what it is with me and cannons. Every time I misfire with them, I seem to always lose my war machine. They only die on a roll of 1 in Warhammer the Old World as well, so that's not very likely. This, of course, is particularly irritating because these bombards represented really my only way of making this game anything other than a turgid snooze fest towards a marginal defeat. It is also particularly unlucky that I've lost the bombard on the left, because there was no earthly way that Scott was going to be able to kill that with his ambushers, which is rather more than can be said for the one on the right, which is a lot more vulnerable. The next shot we see here I think might be from my turn 3, but I don't think it takes too much imagination, punks, to work out what was happening in the turn that you missed. One clue can be inferred from that beer glass on the left-hand side. It's now empty. Now, as you can see, my yeoman guard have had to start skedaddling away because those skeletons were getting a bit too close. The Pegasus Knights flap into a line to threaten the front of one of the skeleton units, but they're not fancying any form of charge yet. One of my bowman units elects to try and skirt to the side of one of those skeleton archer wedges, which is a little bit funky. To be honest, I don't think I'm going to be able to hold on to all my peasants all the time, so I think that Scott is going to get a chance to shoot some of those off. But my peasant bowmen are of course worth only 50 points each. The only other thing that happens, as you can see, punks, is my Green Knight, instead of going after Dave the Charioteer, decides to go after these skeleton skirmishers. Scott's brought both of them on in his middle table edge, and they're going to walk towards my bombard and single archer unit on the right-hand corner of the board. Of course, I'm hoping that the man in green can destroy both of them, and I'm not going to lose my bombard or that other unit. These are, of course, really quibbles with low-value units, but the main fundamentals of this game are that Scott is banking 60 points per turn, and now my yeoman guard have been shifted off the central objective, which was always going to happen quite soon. I'm now not scoring any. Here we can see the Green Knight's adventure in a little bit more detail. He charges one of the skeleton skirmishing archer unit, blocks and destroys it. However, that buys the other unit enough time to start closing in on my bombard. For its part, this war machine decides to go for one more money shot against the flanks of one of these skeleton archer blocks, and once again threads a cannonball between some characters, which again pass their lookout sirs. The price for taking this gamble, of course, is to leave the skeleton skirmishers in front of it unharmed. The bombard gets off a couple of grape shots against this unit and kills about 4 of the skeletons. The remaining 6 close on the crew in combat, and we fight a number of quite close rounds of hand-to-hand combat. There are only 3 skeletons left, but unfortunately the bombard is destroyed. That was probably a minor mistake by me there. I think I should have kept those 10 peasant bowmen next to the bombard, then I think I would have been able to see off that threat. As it is though, the Green Knight is still able to finish off the remainder of that secondary skirmishing unit. Really, the conclusion of this game can be seen by some dancing in the centre of the battlefield. Scott's archer units turn round and try and blow up my peasant bowmen. As you can see, one of them is reduced to just 2 models and another one reduced to 6. The 2 main stars close in the middle of the battlefield against my Pegasus Knights with all the characters in them. Miss Mascarin twice fails to get Travel Mystical Pathway, which would have placed the Yeoman Guard in a much better formation for potentially helping the Pegasus Knights on my turn 6 charge. Eventually, we arrive at that moment, and I ah about whether to do it or not. Scott does have the glittering robe up on his secondary unit, but I decide it's got to be worth it. The combat phase is actually a much closer run thing than I imagined. Scott's archers stand and shoot and do a couple of wounds to the Pegasus Knights before they even get in. Bergamot Magdalene goes into a challenge with Scott's Herald, but even with the Paymaster's coin and the Lucky Heirloom, completely whiffs his attacks and isn't able to destroy his undead opponent. For his part, the Herald manages to smack a couple of wounds off Bergamot Magdalene, so the Baron comes off by far the worst of it. Topley, meanwhile, is in combat with 2 of the characters. I'd been very careful to place my 2 heroes on both edges of the Pegstar unit to give them maximum capacity to try and take off some of the Tomb King HQ. Unfortunately though, Topley also fights badly and is only able to skewer one of the mortuary priests, leaving the other wizard unharmed. Fortunately, my 2 remaining Pegasus Knights and the Royal Pegasi fight well enough to be able to kill enough skeleton warriors to ensure I don't lose combat. In the end, that final charge was really much ado about nothing. I finished 55 points to the good, but flirted with potentially conceding half points for my Pegasus Knights. I think I was a little bit unlucky there, though. I think on another day I could have reasonably expected to take out another couple of characters. Not that they were very valuable. The only other relatively minor thing I'm able to do is use my unit of Knights of the Realm in marching column to ride up behind one of those skeleton units to pinch the objective off them from behind. And that was that. Not much of a game, unfortunately, but then I suppose it never was going to be much of one. When I complain sometimes about how Warhammer the Old World is rather flat, rather rock, paper, scissors, and rather chalk and cheese, this is what I mean. This sort of thing never, or at least almost never, happened in 8th edition, simply because there was so much more depth in the game, so much more depth in the magic, that even a clash between two very extreme, honed, optimized armies always produced something that was interesting, rather than a Mexican standoff. Right, so what was the result? After we count the points up, which doesn't take long, we find that Scott has won this game by 13 points to 7. To be honest, the game was pretty much always going to be about a 12-8 win to the Tomb Kings before we even went into it. The reason it was a 13-7 is because Scott killed a few more of my points that he shouldn't, in inverted commas, have killed, in the shape of my 2 bombards, whereas I killed only 2 mortuary priests that weren't part of the automatic ones that I should have got, and failed to kill the single lone charioteer. All of these things are, of course, minor quibbles about fixtures and fittings, but unfortunately that is what the game came down to, so that's what I'm telling you about. Overall, to be honest, I think I was rather unlucky to get this matchup in this scenario, a Tomb King army that I could do almost nothing about, in a scenario where it was guaranteed to get 720 points just by turning up. For reference, had there been no objectives in this game, it would have been a draw, with us both killing around 200 points each, so you can see what a big swing those objectives made. And so, with the conclusion of Game 5, the players gathered at the front on some rather nice seats to hear the final announcement. As well as the Masters competition for the top 24 players, there had also been a side event going on at the same time, with more players also playing Warhammer the Old World, which is why the hall looks as full as it does. And needless to say, you can tell the atmosphere is good just from these photographs, and it was. The Britannia Hotel Conference Hall is by far the best venue I've seen used in Warhammer the Old World. You'll see that not only are the tables fabulously lit, they also have side tables, which enables players to put all their toys there, rather than having to put them on the floor or potentially on a corner of the battlefield once they're dead. As well as just making matters spacious and comfortable, it means that you get excellent photographs of your games. The Forgotten North team have developed something here that's undeniably excellent, and I look forward to returning before too long. Anyway, on to the results, and it's no surprise that King Pash is the grand champion with his grand CATHAY. Scott comes second, and Charlie comes third, meaning that I played all 3 of the top players. For myself, even with my 1-point tournament penalty, I come 4th, which is probably rather good considering the relatively modest number of points I scored overall. As I said though, relatively few of these games ended in decisive big wins, and I did get a couple of those, which is why I was boosted up as much as I was on 2 wins, a draw and 2 losses. It will not escape many astute viewers' notice that the top 3 armies were all CATHAY and Undead. This theme has been repeated at many of the Warhammer the Old World events in 2026. Well punks, you've been with me for 2 hours and 10 minutes, and so there we are. No silverware to write home about this time, apart from winning the best painted prize, needless to say, but still a thoroughly enjoyable competitive Warhammer the Old World experience. Let's have a little chat now about how this army performed overall, in retrospect. So punks, what is there to say about the worshipful Brotherhood of Shadow and Bone and Baron Topley and Bergamot Magdalay's adventures up in Newcastle? Well, I think it more or less proved that what I thought about the competitive state of Warhammer the Old World was correct. Bretonnian Exiles are a very good army, against certain opposition. That kind of opposition, primarily Double Dragon style lists, was not unfortunately that well represented up here at the Masters. Against Undead, it didn't really look too clever. That's not to say that I think Undead will automatically beat Bretonnian Exiles, because I don't. But against good players with big blocks who know what they're doing, I don't think the Bretonnians should be winning too many games. So, for a review, let's start with my two barons and begin with Bergamot Magdalene with his Monster Slayer. Well, obviously he excelled in my game 1. He killed a 500-point dragon. In my game 2, he destroyed one of Pash's Shigengan generals, although he wasn't worth many points. In the final 3 games, perhaps he was a little unlucky to not face any monsters, which are what he's really built to destroy. Monsters are very common in Warhammer the Old World, so to go through 3 games without facing a single one is at the very least unlikely. Topley, with his Virtue of Knightly Temper and his Frontier Axe, saw a bit more utility. He was also very useful against Jack's Bretonnians, and had a role to play against Charlie's vampires as well. The two barons did of course support each other, and I think that was particularly in evidence against Jack's Bretonnians in terms of the board control that it gave me. Overall, they're definitely good, and I absolutely would have both of them rather than one or the other in any competitive Exiles list. In particular, I think that in many of my games, even in combats that could potentially have been fought but weren't, the Gauntlet of the Duel once again proved a decisive magic item, and once again I can't stress how surprised I am that players don't seem to use it. As for my wizard, Miss Mascarin, well yes, she was useful. She was able to sit in the middle of the battlefield and use her 24-inch dispel range to good effect. In terms of her actual spells, I don't really think she ever got to do anything particularly decisive with them. The obvious bird in the hand was the earthen ramparts, but as it transpired, the men-at-arms were more or less unfightable anyway for most of the tournament, and so that didn't really have that much effect. As with most things in Warhammer the Old World, you really have to come across the right kind of opposition for your own pieces to come into effect. As it was, I don't think Miss Mascarin was really able to do anything too decisive. However, she didn't die in any of the games, and also was quite useful at dispelling enemy magic, so she was absolutely worth her points. And then finally the Green Knight, carrying of course a very considerable nerf in this competition of not being able to charge on the turn he appears. I think that nerf on its own more or less reduces the Green Knight's potency from an auto-include to something that's merely nice to have. Now woe be it for me to criticise comp, but I think that that's a little bit overdone. Nonetheless though, I can't pretend he wasn't useful, but like perhaps some of my other characters, I think he faced some unfortunate matchups. The 2 undead armies I faced had no high-value targets for him to go against, and also had lots of static combat res. Jack's Bretonnians, meanwhile, could outmaneuver him and had plenty of magic weapons of their own, and a Green Knight of their own. Against Pash, had I not been one-shotted by that thrice-cursed Ring of Jet, I think the Green Knight would have won me that game. As for the rest of my army, well, the Yeoman Guard was solid, brick-like and immovable. They only really got their mettle tested against Pash in the second game, and they managed to hold on for long enough to deprive him of scoring any points and to keep holding me on to some objectives. On hindsight, perhaps I could have been a little bit more aggressive with them and trusted their own survivability a little bit more. The archers, for 50 points for 10 men, were an absolute bargain and were able to run around, seldom die, and do a little bit of irritating damage here and there, as well as holding plenty of objectives. While they're hardly going to crash too many parties on their own, a 50-point 10-man unit of peasant skirmishing bowmen is pretty good in Warhammer the Old World. As for my poor old miserable unit of core knights, well, they actually did probably better than you would think. That's because they were well aware of their limitations and didn't try and do any fighting at all. They ran around in marching column and picked up some objectives here and there. They felt absolutely like the core tax that they are, but nonetheless they did contribute a few things here and there. As for the core Pegasus Knights, well yes, absolutely they were excellent, as everyone knows that they are. Again, they didn't get their mettle tested too often, because they only usually went into fights that they can win. Probably their crowning achievement was smashing through that regiment of Jade Warriors against Pash in a single charge. That was impressive. Finally, we come to what I think must be the booby prize, which are my 2 bombards. They just didn't really do anything much. They managed to destroy one of Jack's bombards on the game 4, and also managed to get a potentially amazing money shot against Pash, but then I was unlucky with my damage rolls. Cannons are of course great in Warhammer of any edition, because they give you lots of board control, because opponents are always scared of the damage that they can do. That being said, I do feel that a D3+1 wound cannon with triple save dragons running around the park isn't really something to be that scared of. Thus, while the two bombards are an auto-include in any Bretonnian Exiles list, I wouldn't just pick Exiles purely to get access to them. Overall, punks, that's my army review. Rather duller and more forensic than perhaps I've been before, but I think that armies in Warhammer the Old World have more or less reached the right kind of price in the overall kind of marketplace of competitiveness. I think that the opposition I ran up against in these 5 games was generally not particularly great for the army that I brought. Sure, I got one good matchup in Game 1, but that was really the only good matchup. Had the dice come out differently and I'd drawn different players, maybe I would have got 3 good matchups, and then I think my army would have performed still better than it did. So there we are. That's the state of dialed-up Warhammer the Old World in competitive settings. Is it better than the game was out of the box in 2024? Yes, I think it certainly is. Does it have sufficient depth, sufficient interactivity, and sufficient variability to be played in a sort of guns-drawn super-competitive environment by professional players? Questionable. One point that I found somewhat curious is that while the Masters was very strict with making players submit perfect army lists and penalising them with tournament point penalties if they didn't, all of the games, including against the very best players, were incredibly relaxed. There was one point in my game against Pash where he moved his unit of Jade Warriors and then replaced them in a similar position and then did something different with them. I barely even noticed this at the time, but I noticed someone commenting on the livestream video on the Darwy After Dark channel that this was actually a full take-back and absolutely had no place in high-level competitive play. Now, without getting into the specifics of that debate, and by the way, I had no problem with Pash doing that, it did strike me as somewhat ironic that a culture of competitive Warhammer the Old World seems to have emerged where we're very strict about list and army composition, but extremely relaxed about the way the game is actually played. There seems no particular logical reason for this to me. You should either be strict for both, or loose with both. However, I think it reflects the fact that Warhammer the Old World army lists are at least precise and can be checked officiously, whereas the rules are so vague that there's absolutely no way that you can really do Lawyerhammer properly. It's probably thus a manifestation of wanting to have a competitive game that players are very strict about the area where you can be precise and where you can measure. That of course gets us down to the whole gentleman versus players debate once again. For many people who are watching this video or who play Warhammer, Warhammer will always be and forever will be a game of gentlemen, which is to say not just a game that is played by gentlemen, but a game that you need to be a gentleman in order to play. Now that's not a philosophy I agree with myself. While I like to play gentlemen and aspire to be one myself, I don't think the rules should require you to be one to even have a functioning game. I think that the 2 years we've been playing Warhammer the Old World reveal a mismatch between what the writers of the game assumed would be played by Warhammer players and by what actually existed in the true environment that the game was released into. While they were knowledgeable about the deeper history of Warhammer Fantasy, they were surprisingly ignorant of its more recent past, by which I mean competitive 8th edition. Oh yes, her again. This gaping chasm in their historical memory caused them to underestimate the appetite for a tight rule set that could be played between 2 players with knives out. There was something beautiful about their naivety, punks. But they were naive because they stuck their heads into the sand and didn't learn the lessons of what really happened a decade ago. In 8th we had a gamesman's rule set, which could be played by gentlemen. In Old World we have a gentleman's rule set, which can't really be played by gamesmen. That is the core contradiction. It works one way round, but not really the other. I don't want to be too negative, punks. I'm loving it. I love the games. I love the chat. I love the controversy. I can't wait for the 2nd edition of this game, which probably won't be too long in the offing. But to be able to get the best and the truest 2nd edition of Warhammer the Old World, the game's designers must look into the mirror at what really happened at the end of Warhammer Fantasy. There stands a real lady of the unglamorous reality that we'd prefer to conveniently forget, rather than a romantic siren that we prefer to remember. If you look closely, you can see her lips are moving. You don't need to resurrect her to heed her words.